Have you ever felt a shiver that seemed to come not from the cold, but from time itself? A deep, ancient chill that whispers of a world buried beneath the one you know. It's a memory you carry in your bones, in the very water that makes up your blood. A memory of a planet that was not your own, yet gave birth to everything you are. Tonight, we are going to remember it together. We are going to travel back, far back, into the heart of the great winter, into an age of crystal and silence, when the world held its breath under a blanket of unending ice. So find a quiet place. Settle in. Let the noise of your world fade away, and let your mind drift. There are no clocks here, no schedules to keep. We are stepping outside of time to walk through a world that moved to a rhythm so slow, so impossibly vast, that entire lifetimes were but a single fleeting heartbeat in its long frozen dream. As we begin this journey into the quiet of the past, take a moment to share one word in the comments that comes to mind when you think of a world sleeping under ice. Let's see what this lost world whispers to us, even before we fully arrived. The story does not begin with a crash or a bang, but with a wobble. A tiny, almost imperceptible tilt in the Earth's slow spin, a gentle stretch in its long dance around the sun. Imagine the planet as a spinning top, losing just a fraction of its momentum. Over 1,000 years, this cosmic waltz, this slow pulse of the heavens, began to change how the sun's warmth touched the world. Summers in the far north grew cooler, not by much, but just enough. The snows of one winter no longer melted away completely, but lingered, a pale scar on the green land. Another year passed, and another layer remained. Century by century, the lingering snows began to build, pressing down on themselves with their own patient weight. The air squeezed from their crystals until they hardened, transformed, and became something else entirely. They became ice. From this quiet beginning, the first mountain glaciers were born, small at first, clinging to the high peaks. But they grew. Inch by inch, foot by foot, they crept downward, their immense weight carrying them into the valleys below. Once they started to move, they became an army of frozen silence, an unstoppable force that would eventually claim a third of the planet. At their peak, these crystalline shields were titans. The Great Northern Crown buried a whole continent, stretching from the Arctic Circle deep into the lands that are now temperate and green. It was a single, unbroken sheet of ice, miles thick in places, its surface rising higher than any mountain range we know today. Across the ocean, its twin covered the northern shores of another continent, reshaping the land with a power that defied imagination. The world itself bowed beneath this weight. The very crust of the planet, the solid rock beneath our feet, sank under the load. A slow and reluctant submission to the rule of the ice. But this wasn't a simple deep freeze. The great winter was a cycle, a breath drawn in and held for 100,000 years, then slowly released. The planet's slow pulse in the heavens continued its rhythm, and with each long beat, the ice would advance or retreat. It was a planetary tide, grinding rock to dust, carving valleys where there had been mountains, and leaving behind a world remade in its image. So let's not begin with the science. Not yet. Let us begin with the feeling. Picture yourself there. You are standing on a wide, open plain in a land that will one day be a bustling nation. But now the horizon is not a line of buildings or trees. It is a wall, a sheer cliff of fractured blue-white ice that stretches from one end of your vision to the other, its peak lost in the pale, hazy sky. The air is thin, sharp, and so dry it stings your lungs. It carries the scent of stone and snow, and an emptiness so profound, it feels like the world's first morning. The silence is absolute, broken only by the whisper of a wind that has traveled over 1,000 miles of ice to reach you. And yet, this world is not dead. Far from it. Out on the frozen plains, you can see them. Herds of shaggy behemoths, their great curved tusks sweeping through the snow, their heavy coats like curtains of dark hair, swaying with each deliberate step. In the Americas, giants of a different sort, towering sloths, covered in thick hide, lumber across the land, their movements slow and ancient. And hiding in the tall, dry grass, a predator waits, its muscles coiled. A shadow stalker, its long ivory daggers catching the pale light as it prepares to strike. This was the world of the great winter. Colder, yes, but also wilder, grander, and filled with a life that was as immense and unforgiving as the ice itself. This was a planet of giants, walking on the roof of a buried world. And somewhere in the warmer pockets, in the lands the ice never touched, small bands of your own ancestors are huddled around fires. They are carving tools from stone, stitching clothes from hide, and telling stories in the flickering light. They do not know they live in a great age of ice. For them, this is simply the world. This is life. And that is the most unsettling truth about the deep past. It felt normal to those who lived it. The ice was not an invader. It was the landscape. The giants were not monsters. They were the herds they followed. And the cold was not an enemy. It was the air they breathed. To truly understand them, and to understand the world the ice left behind, we have to walk into that cold with them. We have to feel the bite of that wind and see the world through their eyes. Because this is just the beginning. The great winter has many more secrets to share, buried deep beneath its silent, frozen heart. The cold did not arrive like a storm. It seeped into the world, a slow and patient poison. The planetary sigh, the cosmic waltz of our world's orbit, was the architect of this change, but the Earth itself was its accomplice. As the northern lands cooled and the first great fields of ice began to form, they reflected more of the sun's light back into space. This created a feedback loop. More ice meant less warmth, which in turn meant even more ice. The planet began to refrigerate itself. The oceans too played their part. As the world cooled, the seas grew colder and began to absorb more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, pulling the planet's greenhouse blanket a little thinner. This chilled the air even further, allowing the ice to press southward. A slow crystalline tide that seemed unstoppable. The air itself grew different. It became drier, thinner. With so much of the world's water being drawn up and locked away into the colossal ice shields, the atmosphere lost much of its moisture. Deserts expanded across the globe, and the great tropical forests of the equator shrank, giving way to open savannas and grasslands. Winds, born from the stark temperature difference between the frozen poles and the warmer equator, grew fierce and relentless. They scoured the open plains, picking up the fine dust ground into powder by the advancing glaciers and carrying it for thousands of miles. This dust, this loess as it's now called, settled in thick blankets over entire continents, turning the sky into a permanent, hazy veil and burying the land under layers of fine, pale soil. Imagine living under such a sky. The sun would not be the bright, cheerful orb we know, but a distant, muted glow. Its light diffused and weakened by 1,000,000 tons of dust suspended in the air. The world would be painted in shades of gray and pale yellow, a landscape of muted colors and long, faint shadows. Yet even in this harsh, windswept world, life was not just enduring, it was thriving in its own brutal way. The plants that survived were hardy things, tough grasses and low-lying shrubs that hugged the ground to escape the punishing wind. They had evolved to withstand the deep freeze of winter and burst into life during the brief, intense summers. And it was these plants that fed the giants. The shaggy behemoths and their stockier cousins, the mastodons, roamed in colossal herds, their bodies perfectly adapted to the cold. They possessed thick layers of fat for insulation, and their blood had unique properties, allowing it to carry oxygen efficiently even in the most frigid temperatures. A biological miracle that kept their extremities from freezing solid. Following them were the predators, creatures as formidable as the ice itself. The scythe-tooths, with their terrifying ivory daggers, were masters of the ambush, their powerful stocky bodies built for a single devastating burst of strength. Packs of dire wolves, larger and heavier than any wolf today, with jaws designed to crush bone, tracked the herds with unnerving intelligence and stamina. And ruling over them all were the cave lions, enormous cats that ranged across the frozen steppe, their coordinated hunts a display of lethal grace. But beyond these titans, there was a hidden world of survivors. Tiny rodents like lemmings and voles created intricate networks of tunnels beneath the snowpack, an insulated subworld where the temperature remained stable and the howling wind was just a distant rumble. In this hidden kingdom, they lived out their lives, forming the crucial base of a food chain that supported everything from the swift Arctic fox to the silent, watchful snowy owl. This was a world of profound contrasts. It was a place of immense, violent power where glaciers could crush mountains, yet their movement was too slow for a human eye to perceive. It was a world of crushing cold, yet the bodies of the great beasts burned with an inner fire hot enough to keep them alive. It was a world of scarcity and hardship, yet it supported a density of giant animal life that our modern world can barely imagine. If you could have stood on the edge of one of those advancing glaciers, you would have felt the deep hum of the planet itself, not a sound you could hear with your ears, but a vibration in the ground, a palpable sense of immense weight and slow, relentless pressure. The air would feel heavy, ancient, and you would understand in that moment that you were standing on a planet that was not sleeping, but transforming. The great winter was not a static state of being. It was a process, a crucible that was forging the land, the seas, and every living thing into something new. And from this frozen stage, the story of our own species would truly begin. One slow, deliberate step at a time into the heart of the cold. When the ice ruled the world, it wasn't only the land that seemed impossibly vast. The creatures that walked upon it were titans, shaped by an environment that was both boundless and unforgiving. To exist in that world was to feel perpetually small, to be a fleeting presence in a landscape of giants. This was the age of megafauna, a time when size itself was a declaration of survival. The great herds were the first and most visible pulse of life on the frozen plains. Imagine an endless wind-scoured steppe, not silent and empty, but alive with the thunder of movement. The shaggy behemoths, the tusked wanderers of the north, marched in long, deliberate lines, their shaggy coats swaying like dark tapestries of coarse hair. Their curved tusks, some stretching over 15 feet long, were not just for defense. They were tools, used to sweep away snow and unearth the frozen grasses beneath. These were not rare solitary beasts, as we often picture them. They were social creatures, gathering in family groups of dozens, sometimes migrating in super herds of hundreds, their combined weight making the very ground tremble. Their footprints, pressed deep into the frozen earth, carved highways across the continents that other animals and eventually humans would follow for millennia. Alongside them roamed the mastodons, the stockier, forest-dwelling cousins of the behemoths. With shorter legs and straighter, spear-like tusks, they were perfectly suited for the boreal forests and wetlands that fringed the edges of the great ice shields. They were browsers, not grazers, tearing at spruce branches and stripping bark from trees with a steady, grinding determination, their presence shaping the very structure of the ancient woodlands. But this frozen parade was far more than a procession of proboscideans. The grasslands themselves were a sea of life. Herds of steppe bison, their shoulders heavy with muscle and their heads low against the cutting wind, moved in dark, flowing rivers across the landscape. Muskoxen, low-slung and broad, with coats of hair so long it brushed the ground, would cluster in tight, defensive circles at the first scent of a predator, their curved horns forming an impenetrable wall. Ancient horses, smaller and hardier than their modern descendants, galloped in tight-knit bands, their hooves striking the hard ground in a rhythm as old as the glaciers themselves. And where there are herds, predators will follow. The hunters of the great winter were as colossal as their prey. Dire wolves prowled the edges of the herds, their intelligence matched only by their ferocity. Larger and more robustly built than any wolf alive today, their teeth were a unique combination of slicing carnassials and bone-crushing molars, allowing them to consume a carcass entirely, leaving nothing for scavengers. But the true lords of the hunt were the great cats. The scythe-tooths, with their iconic curved fangs, were not pursuit predators. They were specialists in ambush and sudden, overwhelming force. They would lie in wait, their spotted coats providing camouflage in the sparse vegetation, before lunging to bring down prey many times their size. Their fangs were not for biting in the traditional sense, but for a deep, precise stabbing thrust at the neck or belly, causing catastrophic blood loss. Even more imposing were the cave lions, leaner but nearly twice the weight of today's African lions. They ranged across the entirety of the northern steppe, from Europe to the Americas, and likely hunted in coordinated prides, their collective strength allowing them to challenge even a fully grown behemoth. Imagine standing in the shadow of the great ice walls, these titanic rivers of frozen water, looming on the horizon like a frozen mountain range. The air near them would carry a palpable chill, a cold that felt ancient and absolute. The silence would be broken by the occasional deep groan or explosive crack of shifting ice, a sound that echoed for miles, a constant reminder to every living thing of the immense indifferent power that governed their world. Yet for all their dominance, the glaciers were not static. They advanced and retreated in their slow cosmic rhythm, grinding continents, scouring away soil, and reshaping the world beneath them. Where they passed, they left behind a raw, naked landscape of bare stone and gravel. They carved deep fjords and gouged out the basins that would later fill to become the Great Lakes of the world. They created cliffs and ridges that dictated the migration paths of the giant herds, funneling them into new lands, and in so doing, creating new opportunities for the predators and the humans who hunted them. In the shadow of these glaciers, life persisted through remarkable adaptations. Many of the great beasts carried thick layers of subcutaneous fat, a vital layer of insulation against the bitter cold. Their coats were marvels of biological engineering, with long, coarse guard hairs to shed snow and a dense underlayer of fine wool that trapped body heat with incredible efficiency. Even their blood was different, a complex cocktail of proteins that helped them endure where other creatures would have frozen. And then there were the humans, our ancestors. They learned to live alongside these giants. For them, a behemoth was not just a source of terror, but a walking ecosystem of resources. From its bones, they built the framework of their shelters. From its hide, they fashioned warm, durable clothing. From its sinews, they made cordage. And from its ivory tusks, they carved tools, ornaments, and mysterious figurines. Its meat provided the precious calories and fat that allowed small bands of hunters to survive in a world where the nights were long and the warmth of the fire was the only thing holding back an eternity of cold. Still, the scale of this world could dwarf any single life. A glacier could stretch for 1,000 miles. A herd of behemoths could take days to pass from one horizon to the other. Even the sky seemed larger, its pale, dusty light reflecting off an endless expanse of snow and ice in every direction. This was not a world made for comfort. It was a world that demanded resilience, and in return, it forged creatures, both human and animal, into survivors of extraordinary fortitude. To stand on that cold and windswept land would have been to see the earth in one of its rawest, most majestic forms. The air sharp enough to make your teeth ache. The sound of distant ice shifting like the groan of a sleeping god. The sight of animals larger than houses moving in slow, deliberate lines across the horizon. Every part of it spoke of a planet reshaped by forces far beyond any single creature's control. And yet, there was a delicate, brutal balance to it. The glaciers advanced, but they also retreated. The giants thrived, but they also fell to hunters, or vanished into the snow when food grew scarce. Life persisted not because it conquered the cold, but because it learned to live within its rhythm. As the world moved through these frozen millennia, this balance would be tested again and again, and somewhere in the midst of it all, humans kept learning, watching, and following the slow dance of the Earth and its icebound titans. But before we follow them further, we must pause and consider the stage itself. We speak of this age lasting for thousands, even millions of years. But what does that truly mean? Our lives are measured in days and seasons, in the familiar cycles of work and rest. Our minds struggle to grasp a century, let alone a millennium. The Great Winter operated on a timescale so vast, it is almost a different dimension of existence. Imagine time not as a line, but as a landscape. Your own life is a small, warm campfire in that landscape, burning brightly for a few short decades. Everything you know, your memories, your hopes, the faces of those you love, exists within the circle of that light. Now imagine looking up from your fire into the immense darkness. The time of the Great Winter is like a mountain range on the horizon of that darkness. Its peaks and valleys shaped not in centuries, but in epochs. The slow advance of a glacier, a process that could take 10,000 years, would be a single gentle slope on one of those mountains. The entire existence of a species, like the scythe tooth, might be a single long ridge in that range. To the people who lived in that age, time did not feel fast or slow. It simply was. The seasons turned, children were born, the elders passed into memory. They did not see the glaciers moving. They did not perceive the climate shifting. They lived their lives on the surface of a great, slow-moving river of time, unaware of the deep, powerful currents that were carrying them and their entire world towards an unknown future. We try to measure it, to capture it in numbers, but these are just abstractions. The true nature of this deep time is a feeling, a sense of immense, patient, and utterly indifferent presence. It is the time of rock, of ice, of starlight. And to walk in the world of the Great Winter is to feel your own brief flickering existence measured against that eternal scale. It is a profoundly humbling and strangely comforting feeling. And it is in that deep, slow time that the true engine of the frozen world did its work. Now, as we adjust our senses to that immense scale, our focus turns to the engine that drove it all, the strange, intricate, and powerful changes in the planet's climate, and how they set every one of these epic events into motion. The cold was never constant. Even at the zenith of the Great Winter, the Earth was not locked in a single, unchanging freeze. It breathed. In a slow, rhythmic cycle stretching over tens of thousands of years, the planetary temperature rose and fell like a slow-motion tide. With each ebb and flow, the great ice shields advanced or retreated, rewriting the maps of the world and reshaping the lives of every creature that depended on it. To truly understand this lost world, it is not enough to picture a planet buried in snow. We have to see how that snow moved, how the cold deepened and then eased, and how these long, quiet changes composed the grand symphony of the frozen age. At the heart of this rhythm were the cosmic waltzes, the cycles of celestial mechanics, first calculated by a forgotten mathematician. They are driven by the intricate and ever-changing way the Earth moves through space in its long journey around the Sun. Our orbit is not a perfect circle. Over a cycle of 100,000 years, it stretches into a more pronounced ellipse and then relaxes back again, changing the distance between our world and its star. The tilt of our planet's axis, the very reason for our seasons, also varies, nodding up and down by a few degrees over a period of about 41,000 years. Finally, there is a gentle wobble, like a spinning top losing its momentum, which alters the timing of the seasons over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years. Each of these movements happens far too slowly for any single generation to perceive. But when their effects align, they change everything. When the orbital stretch is at its greatest and the axial tilt is at its minimum, the summers in the northern hemisphere become cooler and milder. Snow that falls in winter lingers longer into the next year. Ice sheets begin to grow. Conversely, when the tilt increases and the orbit is more circular, The summers grow warmer and stronger, melting more snow, and the ice retreats. It is a celestial balance, subtle and yet utterly relentless, turning the planet from cold to less cold and back again across vast, almost unimaginable stretches of time. Yet, these orbital forcings alone cannot explain the full dramatic force of the Great Winter. The Earth's climate is a complex web of feedbacks, where one small shift triggers a cascade of others. As the ice sheets expand, their bright white surfaces reflect more sunlight back into space, an effect known as albedo, which cools the planet even further. The colder it gets, the more carbon dioxide the oceans can absorb from the atmosphere, locking it away in the deep and thinning the Earth's insulating greenhouse blanket. That drop in CO2 cools the world even more, helping the ice to spread farther south. It is a powerful chain reaction, a planetary cooling spiral that takes millennia to build and even longer to reverse. But the cycle, inevitably, works both ways. When the cosmic waltz shifts and the northern summers begin to warm again, the feedback loop reverses. A small amount of ice melts, exposing darker land and open water, which absorb more of the sun's heat. This extra warmth causes more ice to melt. The warming oceans, in turn, begin to release their stored carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, thickening the greenhouse blanket and trapping more heat. The planet does not simply fall into a frozen age or escape from it. It moves back and forth between these two stable states like a grand pendulum, steady and predictable in its swing, but immense and world-altering in its scale. Even within these grand 100,000-year cycles, there were smaller, more abrupt jolts, sudden, sharp pulses of cold or warmth that rippled across the frozen world. Some of these were triggered by massive volcanic eruptions, which spewed ash and sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere, creating a temporary veil that dimmed the sun and could plunge the planet into a deep chill for years, even decades. Others came from the oceans themselves. As vast currents, the planet's circulatory system abruptly shifted their paths, dramatically redistributing heat between the equator and the poles. And at the edges of the great ice shields, immense lakes of meltwater would sometimes form, held back by dams of frozen water. When those icy barriers inevitably collapsed, they unleashed biblical floods that could rewrite coastlines and might have been powerful enough to temporarily alter the climate for centuries. To live through these changes was to witness the world tilting slowly out of balance and then settling once more into a new equilibrium. For the animals that roamed the steppe and the forests, it meant a life of constant movement, following the land as it changed. Herds of behemoths and bison would push south when the cold bit deep, only to spread north again into newly revealed lands when the ice withdrew. Predators followed their prey, and the small scattered bands of early humans, our ancestors, learned to read these subtle patterns in the land, moving with the seasons and the ever-shifting borders of the cold. The great ice shields themselves recorded these climatic swings in silent, perfect detail. Every year, a new layer of snow falls, and over centuries, it compacts into ice. Within each layer, tiny bubbles of the ancient atmosphere are trapped and preserved. When scientists drill deep into the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, they retrieve cores that are like frozen time capsules. In these cylinders of ancient ice, they can see the planet breathing. They can measure the composition of the air from 500,000 years ago. They find the chemical fingerprints of every advance and retreat, every sharp drop or sudden rise in temperature. In that frozen archive, the complete history of the Great Winter is still waiting, stacked one winter on top of another, a library of deep time written in crystal. It is one thing to read about this planetary rhythm, and another to truly imagine it. Picture yourself standing on a wide, cold plain, the sky a pale, hazy canvas, the wind sharp and unforgiving. Far to the north, a wall of ice looms like a distant mountain range. For centuries, it has been creeping forward mile by slow mile, a silent invasion that no one alive can truly see. Then, after thousands of years, the air begins to warm. the summers lengthen, ever so slightly. The edge of the glacier begins to pull back. Torrents of meltwater stream from beneath it, carving new rivers into the raw earth. The land once buried under 2 miles of ice now lies bare, scoured and open to the sun for the first time in an age. Then in time the cosmic waltz shifts once more. The cold returns, and the long, slow march of the ice begins all over again. This was the breath of the great winter. Slow, steady, and powerful enough to shape continents. It was not a single freeze or a single thaw, but a vast and patient cycle, one that pushed life to its absolute limits and then pulled it back again. In that long rhythmic dance of cold and warmth, animals evolved, humans adapted, and the earth was sculpted into the world we still recognize, even though so much of it has vanished beneath the deceptive warmth of our present day. Yet the story of the Great Winter is not only about cold and ice. It is about the living world that took shape in its pale frozen light. Because while the climate set the stage, it was life itself, strange, massive, and astonishingly resilient, that gave this lost age its true character. Beneath the endless cold and the sweeping plains of ice, life found a way. It did not merely wait for the warmth to return. It adapted, it evolved, and it carved out a place for itself in one of the most hostile environments the Earth has ever known. To survive in the chill of the Great Winter was not simply a matter of endurance. It required a profound transformation, from the smallest insect hiding beneath the snow to the largest beasts roaming the frozen steppe. The ground itself during this long age was not a dead, frozen wasteland. Just beneath the surface of the snow lay a hidden, teeming world, a world built in miniature. In the tundra soils, a vast network of burrows was home to countless rodents. Lemmings, voles, and other small mammals were the invisible foundation of the entire food chain, their survival making possible the lives of the great predators that walked above. These tiny creatures did not hibernate in the traditional sense. Many remained active all winter long beneath the insulating snowpack, their movements carving intricate tunnels and galleries that were entirely invisible from the surface. Down there in the subnivean world, the air was still, the temperature remained remarkably stable, and the thick blanket of snow overhead acted as perfect insulation against the worst of the wind and the deep, penetrating cold. Above them, the larger animals moved across the landscape with a heavy, deliberate grace born of their adaptations. The shaggy behemoths were wrapped in magnificent coats of long, coarse-guard hairs with a dense, fine underlayer of insulating wool that was virtually impervious to the cold. Their blood was a biological marvel, carrying special adaptations that allowed it to release oxygen efficiently, even in the coldest parts of their bodies, keeping their limbs, trunks, and ears from stiffening and freezing. The muskoxen carried thick pelts so effective that snow could settle on their backs for hours without melting, a clear sign that almost no precious body heat was escaping. Even their very shape was an adaptation, their stocky, compact bodies minimizing surface area to conserve warmth. The predators were no less prepared for the brutal conditions. The dire wolves and scythe-tooths were built for strength and stamina, with powerful muscles designed to bring down massive prey in deep snow. Their coats were thick and dense, and their paws were broad, acting like snowshoes to keep them from sinking into the frozen ground as they stalked their quarry. Even the great cave lions, some of the largest felines the world has ever seen, were sculpted by the cold. They were leaner than their modern relatives, but with powerful limbs built for the endless pursuit of Ice Age prey across vast open ground. And the plants that fed this entire frozen world were equally remarkable. At first glance, the landscape of the Great Winter might seem barren, a desolate expanse of white and brown. But just beneath the snow and during the brief, explosive summers, a hardy and surprisingly rich vegetation flourished. Tough, nutrient-dense grasses dominated the behemoth steppe, covering vast areas from Europe to North America. These grasses were perfectly suited for the grazing herds that needed to consume enormous quantities of food nearly constantly to to fuel their internal furnaces against the cold. Mixed among them were tough shrubs and dwarf willows, their branches hugging close to the ground, growing horizontally to stay safe from the relentless, desiccating wind. These plants had evolved to withstand long periods of darkness and deep freeze, but also to respond with incredible speed to the short, intense window of summer sunlight, a frantic season of growth and reproduction. Even insects, the most delicate of creatures, found a way to endure. Some species produced a natural antifreeze within their bodies, special proteins that prevented ice crystals from forming and rupturing their cells. Others laid eggs that could survive the winter completely untouched by the frost, waiting patiently for the brief warmth of summer to awaken the next generation. Birds adapted too. Many species migrated south to escape the worst of the winter, but some stayed, their feathers forming a dense insulating layer, their metabolisms burning hot enough to endure the deepest cold. The snowy owl, for example, patrolled the tundra year-round, its white plumage a perfect camouflage, its diet of lemmings allowing it to thrive in a world that few others could tolerate. And humans, though physically fragile by comparison, were not without their own formidable strategies. Our early ancestors relied on their ingenuity as much as their physical strength. They fashioned warm, effective clothing from animal furs, stitched together tightly using bone needles and sinew thread. They built sturdy shelters from the bones and hides of the giants they hunted, using behemoth ribs as arched frames for tents covered in thick, overlapping layers of animal skin, creating a sanctuary against the elements. But fire was their greatest ally, their most precious technology. It was not only a source of warmth, but the very heart of their survival. It allowed them to cook food, unlocking vital nutrients. It hardened the tips of their wooden spears, and it pushed back against the deep, unrelenting dark of the long winter nights, a flickering beacon of defiance in a world of cold. For these small, nomadic bands of people, life was a constant, intimate negotiation with the cold. Every step into the snow carried a risk. Frostbite, starvation, and predation were daily threats. Yet, they learned to move with the rhythms of the seasons, following the great herds as they migrated, using frozen rivers and coastlines as landmarks across the endless white. They crafted deadly weapons from stone and bone, sharp enough to pierce the thick hides of the beasts they hunted. And over thousands of years, their knowledge of this frozen world deepened until they could live not merely in spite of the cold, but because they had come to understand it. What made this hidden web of life so remarkable was its intricate balance. The snow did not simply bury the world. It shaped it, protected it, and defined it. Beneath its weight, species learned to bend without breaking. Each adaptation, from the smallest vole's tunnel to the behemoth's insulating coat, was a precise answer to an environment that demanded everything and gave little in return. But this world was not only about survival, it was also about transformation. With every great swing of the climate, with every advance or retreat of the glaciers, life shifted. Species that thrived in the deepest cold sometimes vanished when the world warmed. Others emerged, stepping into the ecological niches left behind. The great winter was not a frozen prison. It was a crucible, and from its fires came creatures and behaviors that still echo in the living world today. Even now, in the high tundras of Siberia or the Arctic Circle, you can see living fragments of that ancient survival strategy. The muskox still stands broad and immovable against the wind. Arctic foxes still change their coats from brown to white with the seasons, vanishing into the snow like ghosts. These living remnants are powerful reminders that the age of ice did not end cleanly. It left pieces of itself scattered across the earth, pieces that still endure. And as the glaciers breathed in and out, as the cold deepened and eased, this hidden world beneath the snow never stopped changing. What lay ahead was a planet still in motion, one where ice would carve the land in ways that would reshape the very bones of the earth. The ice was never still. It moved with a force so vast, so patient, and so unrelenting that it reshaped entire continents. When we imagine these glaciers, we often picture silent, static walls of frozen white. But these great ice shields were not passive monuments to the cold. They were colossal engines of change, grinding, crushing, and carving the land beneath them with a geological patience that only the Earth itself can keep. The largest of them, the Great Crystalline Shields, blanketed much of the northern world. In North America, the northern crown stretched from the high Arctic down to what are now the temperate farmlands of the central United States. It was so incomprehensibly thick in places that its surface rose higher than the tallest mountains of the modern world. Across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian Shield covered Scandinavia and pushed deep into northern Europe and Western Asia, its colossal edge slowly grinding forward like a tide of frozen stone. Even in the southern hemisphere, smaller but still immense ice sheets covered the highlands of South America, New Zealand, and parts of Antarctica that reached far beyond their present-day limits. These sheets of ice were not gentle. As they advanced, they scraped the earth bare. They tore away entire forests, crushed rolling hills into dust, and ground solid rock into a fine powder. Beneath their unimaginable weight, the very crust of the planet itself bent downward, sinking slightly under the colossal load. When the ice later retreated, the land rose again in a slow geological rebound that continues even now, thousands of years later, in parts of Canada and Scandinavia. The slow, inexorable movement of the ice left behind landscapes that are still hauntingly easy to recognize. Deep valleys with flat bottoms and impossibly steep, sheer walls, carved by the relentless pressure of moving glaciers, can be found across the northern world, from the fjords of Norway to the glens of Scotland. Great solitary boulders, carried for hundreds of miles from their source, sit scattered across open fields, silent witnesses to the epic journeys they once made, trapped within the heart of the moving ice. And then there are the lakes. Tens of thousands of them, filling the deep basins and depressions gouged out by the passing glaciers. The Great Lakes of North America are perhaps the most famous and spectacular example. Vast inland seas of fresh water, resting in the colossal scars left behind by the retreating northern crown. The glaciers were not merely sculptors of land. They were also the masters of the world's waters. As the ice grew, drawing water from the oceans, sea levels dropped by more than 400 feet, exposing vast coastal plains. When the ice melted, the seas rose again, drowning those same plains beneath the waves. The land bridges that once connected continents, like the sunken path that linked Asia to North America, existed only because so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice. Each advance and retreat of the glaciers rewrote the map of the Earth. Yet for all their world-altering power, the glaciers moved with an almost unbearable slowness. A few feet a day was all it took for their weight to change the face of a continent over millennia. To stand before one was to look upon a force that felt eternal, timeless, even though it was always in motion. You could hear it sometimes, the sharp, percussive crack of shifting ice, the low, resonant groan of a frozen mass pressing against the land. And when meltwater pooled in vast lakes on or beneath the ice, and then broke free, it surged across the earth in floods so massive they carved new channels in the bedrock in a matter of days. These were not gentle rivers. They were torrents that tore at the land with a strength born of centuries of trapped water, suddenly and violently unleashed. But in their wake, they left behind something unexpected. For all their destruction, the glaciers also created new opportunities for life. When they retreated, they revealed fresh ground, stripped clean and yet rich with a fine mineral dust. Plants were quick to colonize these bare landscapes, their seeds carried on the wind, sending tenacious roots into the raw virgin earth. In time, animals followed, and in their footsteps came the first human hunters, tracking the herds into the new lands the glaciers had uncovered. These frozen sculptures also carried stories, frozen libraries within their layers. Deep within the ice itself, scientists have found trapped layers of ancient air, ash from distant, prehistoric volcanic eruptions, and even pollen from plants that grew hundreds of thousands of years ago. Each layer is a perfect record. a single page in the frozen history of the Earth, telling us not only how the ice shaped the land, but how it breathed in perfect rhythm with the changing climate. To the creatures that lived through this age, however, the glaciers were not history. They were absolute boundaries, massive and unmoving walls at the edge of their world. To a behemoth or a bison, a glacier's edge was the end of the known universe, a colossal barrier that could not be crossed. Even humans, clever and determined, could only move along its borders, following the river valleys and coastal plains where the ice had not yet claimed the ground. And as the great ice sheets grew and shrank with the slow, rhythmic pulse of the planet, they drew the map of the world we know now. Every rolling hill in northern Europe, every scattered lake across Canada, every stretch of rich, dark soil in the American Midwest, all of it bears the indelible mark of the glaciers. These were not just masses of frozen water. They were the chisels that carved the modern world. But as they carved the land, they also starved the seas. And in the vast, empty spaces left behind by the retreating oceans, life, both animal and human, would find unexpected and history-altering paths forward. When the great ice shields swelled to their zenith, locking up millions of cubic miles of the planet's water, the oceans drew back like a cosmic tide that would not return for thousands of years. Shorelines stretched outward for hundreds of miles, exposing vast, fertile plains that had been hidden beneath the waves for ages. Rivers carved new, winding paths across this uncovered ground, flowing towards a distant, shrunken sea. Entire continents gained new, unfamiliar edges. The world map looked profoundly different then, familiar in its rough continental shapes, but altered in ways that seem almost impossible to imagine from our modern, water-rich perspective. At the height of the Great Winter, the global sea level dropped by more than 400 feet. This was not a sudden, catastrophic plunge, but a slow, millennial withdrawal, paced by the relentless growth of the glaciers. What had once been shallow coastal waters became windswept grasslands. Bays and inlets turned into dry, sheltered valleys. Islands became connected to mainlands, and great land bridges appeared between continents that today are separated by vast open seas. The most famous and consequential of these was the Sunken Path, the vast stretch of land that once connected the eastern tip of Asia with the western edge of North America. This was no narrow, precarious strip of land. It was an enormous, subcontinental expanse of cold, dry tundra and steppe, hundreds of miles wide, dotted with shallow lakes and meandering rivers. It was a complete ecosystem in its own right, home to vast herds of behemoths, bison, and ancient horses, and roamed by the predators that hunted them. To the animals and the first humans who walked across it, it wasn't a bridge at all. It was a landscape, a country of its own, as real and permanent as any other part of the earth. Farther south, another great shelf joined the islands of Southeast Asia to the mainland, creating a vast, continuous landmass known as Sundaland. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania merged into a single connected supercontinent called Sahul, and across Europe, the floor of the North Sea was exposed, forming a region we now call the Drowned Heartlands, a broad, fertile plain that stretched between what is now Britain and the rest of the continent, crisscrossed by major rivers and dotted with low, rolling hills. These new lands didn't just change the geography of the planet, they fundamentally changed the course of life itself. Animals followed the expanding frontiers, migrating into places where the sea had once barred their way. Humans did the same, tracking the great herds of game across these new, wide-open pathways, slowly but surely spreading across the globe in ways that would shape the entire future of our species. The crossing of the Sunken Path into the Americas was one of the last great human migrations, a journey into an entire hemisphere untouched by human hands. But this global transformation was not limited to the emergence of new land alone. The retreat of the oceans profoundly reshaped the coastlines that remained. Beaches stretched outward for miles, estuaries shrank, and vibrant coral reefs were left high and dry, bleaching and dying as the life-giving water abandoned them. The world's oceans themselves grew colder and significantly saltier due to the massive reduction in fresh water. Their powerful currents, the great conveyor belts of global climate, shifted their paths in response to the new balance of water and ice. These oceanic changes, in turn, fed back into the climate system, helping to lock the Earth in its frozen state for millennia. Even the air above the seas was altered. As the oceans drew back, vast stretches of the exposed continental shelf, now dry land, became immense sources of dust. This dust was swept up by the strong winds of the great winter and carried for thousands of miles. It settled over the land in thick, fertile layers that would later, after the thaw, nourish some of the richest and most productive farmlands on Earth. It was another one of the great ironies of this age. The great winter was not only an age of destruction and loss, but also a hidden age of preparation, a time of laying the geological groundwork for the warmer world that would eventually follow. For the people who lived through it, however, these epic changes would not have been obvious on a human timescale. The sea did not vanish overnight. A hunter could walk the same coastal path his parents had walked, never realizing that far to the east or west, the tide was imperceptibly creeping away, year after year, generation after generation. It was only on the scale of centuries that the transformation would reveal itself. Rivers flowing where there had once been bays, herds of bison grazing on ground that had once been the ocean floor, and new, unknown horizons opening up to the daring few who chose to follow them. And while the ocean stood still in its shrunken state, life adapted with remarkable speed. The newly exposed coastlines became prime hunting grounds. The mouths of the newly extended rivers turned into rich feeding places for migrating birds and fish. Humans learned to use these changes to their advantage, following the trails of the animals that now roamed across these exposed plains, discovering new sources of food and new materials for their tools and shelters. In every corner of the world of the great winter, the receding waters revealed not just new land, but new opportunities. Yet, like the glaciers themselves, the shrunken oceans would not remain fixed forever. As the cosmic waltz continued and the climate eventually began to warm, the ice would begin its long retreat. The seas would slowly creep back in, drowning the lands they had left bare for so long. The drowned heartlands would sink beneath the waves of the North Sea. The sunken path would vanish beneath the waters of the Bering Strait, and the coastlines of the world would draw back to something closer to the familiar shapes we know today. But that part of the story was still far off in the distant future. For now, in the heart of the great winter, the oceans had paused. The planet stood in its frozen state, locked in a delicate balance of ice and sea that held the world steady for thousands upon thousands of years. It was in this frozen, static balance that the great winds began to rise, carrying their burden of dust across the sky, marking the next great force that shaped this ancient, alien world. The cold alone did not define the great winter. Alongside the creeping glaciers and the shrunken seas came a sky heavy with dust and winds that never seemed to rest. The atmosphere during this long age was not the clear, crisp air we might romantically imagine when we picture a frozen world. It was a thick, hazy medium, constantly filled with fine particles of rock and soil carried across continents, turning the sun into a pale, distant smudge and painting the sky in muted, melancholy tones of gray and ochre. This dust was a direct consequence of the ice. When the great glaciers advanced, their immense weight and grinding movement pulverized the rock beneath them into a fine, flour-like powder. As the ice pulled back during warmer intervals or stalled at its edges, the relentless winds swept across these barren, newly exposed plains, lifting the finest particles high into the air and driving them for hundreds, even thousands of miles. Each storm added more dust to the atmosphere, spreading a planetary blanket of sediment that settled far from its original source. In many regions of the world, these layers of ancient dust still remain. Vast deposits of this wind-blown silt, called loess, stretch across China, parts of Europe, and North America. They are hundreds of feet thick in some places, built up grain by microscopic grain by the tireless winds of the great winter. Over time, these dusty plains would weather into some of the most fertile agricultural soils on Earth, a final unexpected gift from a frozen age. But during the great winter itself, they were part of an unending, brutal cycle. Wind, dust, and the relentless penetrating cold. The weather patterns that carried this dust were harsh and wildly unpredictable. The vast temperature differences between the frozen northern continents and the slightly warmer equatorial regions drove powerful, persistent winds. These winds scoured the land, flattening freshly fallen snow into hard-packed sheets as dense as concrete, and sweeping away what little warmth there was to be found on the surface. They carried not only dust, but also snow, piling it high in colossal drifts that could completely swallow entire landscapes, burying everything in their path. Yet the atmosphere of the great winter was not only a world of wind and dust, it was a world of profound extremes. Winters were unimaginably long and bitter, with temperatures regularly plunging far below anything most of us could possibly conceive of. Summers, though brief, could be surprisingly warm and dry in some regions, especially on the great grasslands where the sun's energy, even when weakened by the hazy sky, had little competition from clouds or atmospheric moisture. This sharp, violent contrast between the seasons created an environment where life had to be endlessly adaptable, able to endure the deepest of freezes, and then burst into frantic motion during the very brief windows of growth and relative abundance. Volcanoes added their own chaotic element to this already strange and turbulent sky. Massive eruptions would send plumes of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and deepening the planetary cold for years, sometimes even decades at a time. In the deep layers of the polar ice cores, scientists have found the telltale chemical fingerprints of these ancient cataclysmic eruptions, frozen moments in time when the sky itself grew darker, and the glaciers seized the opportunity to press even farther south. Even the very air itself was different in its composition. The levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere during the Great Winter were far lower than they are today. The thinness of that crucial greenhouse blanket made the atmosphere colder and significantly drier, especially near the great ice shields. In these regions, paradoxically, snow fell quite rarely, not because the cold prevented it, but because there was so little moisture available in the air to form it. The frozen heart of the great winter world was often, in effect, a polar desert of snow, ice, and wind, its surface relentlessly scoured by dry gales, rather than being buried beneath fresh, gentle flakes. For the animals that lived in this world, weather was not a passing concern. It was a fundamental force that shaped their every move. Herds of behemoths and bison learned to follow the shifting wind patterns to find areas where the snow had been blown away, exposing the frozen grass beneath. Predators trailed them, their own survival entirely dependent on these same patterns. Even our early human ancestors learned to read the subtle signs in the sky, watching the movement of the winds and clouds to understand when the weather might shift and when the killing cold would deepen. The dust, too, carried its own complex consequences. While it dulled the sky and coated the ground in a fine, gritty film, it also, paradoxically, fed life. The winds dropped nutrient-rich minerals across the plains, scattering vital elements like iron that fertilized the oceans and made the seemingly barren grasslands of the great winter unexpectedly rich and productive. This strange balance, an atmosphere choked with dust and swept by punishing winds, yet a land that could still feed countless herds of giants, was one of the quiet, defining paradoxes of this lost world. Imagine standing on one of those windswept plains. The horizon is wide and pale, stretching to infinity. The air is so sharp, it feels like breathing tiny needles of ice. The wind is a constant, low moan, never quite stopping. In the distance, a permanent haze hangs low over the land, a thin veil of dust stirred up by storms happening hundreds of miles away. Above it all, the sun glows weakly, a distant, indifferent god, its warmth reaching the ground, but never enough to chase away the deep, persistent bite of the air. In that moment, you could truly feel what it was like to live beneath a sky of the great winter. Harsh, restless, and yet, against all odds, strangely and stubbornly full of life. This atmosphere, with all its dust and sweeping winds, was not just a backdrop to the events of the age. It was a force that actively helped to shape the planet and all its living things. And as the air moved, it carried with it the seeds of the world that lay beneath. The vast grasslands that stretched from horizon to horizon and gave the great winter its most defining feature. The endless frozen steppe where giants roamed and the great drama of survival played out on a scale as vast as the land itself. What did you find most surprising about the atmosphere of this lost world? Let us know your thoughts below. And if you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to subscribe to keep exploring these buried histories with us. Stretching from the western shores of Europe, across the vast expanse of Siberia, and over the sunken path into North America, there was a land unlike anything we can see on Earth today. It was neither a frozen, lifeless tundra nor a dense, dark forest, but something unique, a biome that existed only under the specific conditions of the great winter. It was a vast, cold, dry, and windswept grassland that supported some of the greatest gatherings of large animal life in our planet's entire history. Scientists have given it a name, but for our journey, let's call it the Behemoth Steppe. It was the beating, vibrant heart of the frozen world. The Behemoth Steppe was incomprehensibly enormous, larger than any single biome on the planet today. Its cold, dry air and short, intense summers might sound harsh and unforgiving, but this unique grassland was astonishingly productive. Thick, dense mats of tough grasses, sedges, and herbs blanketed the ground, their genetic makeup perfectly adapted to the brief but intense growing season. These plants did not waste precious energy reaching for the sky like trees in a forest. Instead, they stayed low, their leaves and flowers hugging close to the ground, where the relentless wind couldn't strip away their moisture or warmth, and where their deep, fibrous roots could hold fast in the thin, dusty soil left behind by the glaciers. It was this almost unbelievable abundance of highly nutritious grass that allowed the giants of the age to thrive. Herds of shaggy behemoths roamed the steppe in great, continent-spanning populations, their massive, curved tusks sweeping low as they dug through the winter snow to reach the cured, frozen fodder beneath. Vast herds of steppe bison, even larger and more formidable than their modern descendants, grazed in endless moving lines, their heavy, shaggy coats rippling in the constant wind. Wild horses, smaller and stockier than the elegant creatures we know today, with a resilience born of the cold, galloped across the open plains in tightly knit, defensive herds, and mingling among them were the woolly rhinoceroses, enormous broad-shouldered animals with thick, shaggy fur and a massive horn on their snout that they used to push through snow or as a fearsome weapon against any predator bold enough to approach. The predators of the Behemoth Steppe were, by necessity, no less formidable. Packs of dire wolves followed the great herds, their larger size and more powerful jaws giving them the strength to bring down even the toughest and most well-defended prey. The great cave lions, apex predators nearly twice the size of any modern lion, hunted in coordinated, intelligent groups, stalking the fringes of the vast grasslands. And then there were the scythe-tooths, the ultimate ambush hunters, who would wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike, their curved blade-like fangs designed to pierce deep and fast, delivering a quick and brutal end. But it was not only these great charismatic beasts that lived here. The Behemoth Steppe was a complex ecosystem, and smaller creatures filled every available niche. Lemmings and ground squirrels burrowed deep beneath the earth, their extensive tunnel systems crisscrossing the frozen soil like an invisible subterranean web. Arctic foxes, masters of camouflage, darted across the steppe, either scavenging from the kills left by the larger predators or hunting the countless rodents that lived just below their feet. Even great birds of prey like vultures and ravens circled high overhead, their sharp eyes scanning the plains, waiting for the telltale sign of a fresh kill, a sign that the snow below was marked red. And then there were the humans. They came late to this vast land compared to its other, more ancient inhabitants. But when they arrived, they did not just pass through. They became a part of it. Small nomadic bands of our early ancestors followed the herds across the open plains, tracking the behemoths and the bison, learning their ancient patterns of migration, and testing their courage and skill against the raw, untamed vastness of this frozen wilderness. They learned to build their shelters from the bones of the very giants they hunted, covering the skeletal frames with thick hides to keep out the ceaseless wind. And they painted the magnificent creatures they hunted on the hidden walls of deep caves. Their vivid images a permanent record of both their deep admiration for these animals and their own struggle for survival. What made the behemoth steppe so unique was not just its immense size, but its remarkable stability. For thousands upon thousands of years, it remained a world apart, a biome shaped by the deep cold, but also, in a strange way, sheltered by it. The hardy grasses endured the brutal winters, lying dormant and protected beneath the insulating blanket of snow, only to explode back to life with incredible vigor in the 24-hour sunlight of the brief Arctic summer. This predictable, reliable cycle of freezing and renewal sustained a web of life that was astonishingly resilient. Even as the great glaciers advanced and retreated at the steppe's edges, the fundamental character and richness of this land remained. The richness of this lost land can still be glimpsed today. In the frozen permafrost of Siberia, the perfectly preserved remains of behemoths are sometimes found, so complete that their shaggy fur still clings to their hides and their stomachs still hold the undigested remnants of the last grasses they ever ate. These silent frozen relics tell us exactly what kind of world this was. A place where life was stunningly abundant, even in the very shadow of the ice. A place where the ground was hard and the air was dry, and yet there was always enough to feed giants. To stand in the middle of it would have been an overwhelming, almost spiritual experience. The horizon would stretch out in every direction, a perfect, unbroken circle, unmarred by forests or mountains. The wind would sweep endlessly across the plains, carrying the low, resonant sounds of distant herds and the high, lonely calls of predators on the hunt. Every single creature, from the smallest burrowing rodent to the largest tusked wanderer, was part of a single, intricately interwoven system, one that turned grass and dust and pale sunlight into flesh and bone on a scale almost too large for the human mind to grasp. But this world, for all its colossal size and its long endurance, was not eternal. It depended entirely on the precise climatic conditions of the great winter, the cold, the dryness, to maintain its delicate balance. When the climate finally shifted, when the ice began its final, irreversible retreat, and the rains returned, and the forests crept northward, the great behemoth steppe began to shrink. Its vast, interconnected herds were pushed into smaller and smaller, isolated refuges, until eventually the grassland of giants became only a memory, preserved in fossils, in frozen bones, and in the ancient art on cave walls. Before that day came, though, the behemoth steppe stood as one of the greatest and most magnificent natural stages the earth had ever known. It was here that humans honed their skills for survival. It was here that the last great beasts of the frozen age ruled. And it was here in this cold and dusty grassland that life learned to endure in ways that would echo long after the steppe itself was gone. From this vast open plain, our journey now moves toward the people who walked it, not just as wanderers, but as survivors who faced a world of ice and wind and giants, and somehow, against all odds, found a way to call it home. Across the endless expanse of the behemoth steppe, and along the barren, windswept edges of the ice, small nomadic bands of humans moved with the rhythm of the seasons. They were not yet the masters of this frozen world, not by any stretch of the imagination, but they were learning. In a land ruled by bitter desiccating winds and towering formidable beasts, survival meant more than just physical strength. It demanded knowledge, skill, cooperation, and above all, an almost miraculous ability to adapt. Life for these early humans was shaped entirely and intimately by the cold. They built their shelters low against the ground, designed to deflect the wind, in the treeless regions of the high steppe, where wood was a rare and precious commodity. They turned to the bones of the very giants they hunted. The massive ribs, tusks, and skulls of the shaggy behemoths were ingeniously stacked and arranged into sturdy domed frames, which were then covered with layers of thick animal hides. The resulting huts were cramped and dark, but they were remarkably effective sanctuaries against even the harshest winter air. Inside, the space was small but warm, lit by the constant flickering glow of a single vital force: fire. Fire was more than a tool for these people. It was a living entity, a boundary between survival and certain death. Around its precious light, families gathered close, their fur clothing pulled tight, their hands outstretched toward the life-giving warmth. It cooked their food, breaking down tough muscle fibers and unlocking critical nutrients. It hardened the tips of their wooden spears, turning them into lethal weapons, and it gave them a measure of protection against the deep, unrelenting dark of the long winter nights. A single carefully tended flame could mean safety in a world where the killing cold waited just beyond the walls, patient and utterly unforgiving. But fire alone was not enough. To survive here, humans learned to shape the stone beneath their feet into a sophisticated arsenal of tools. They chipped flint and chert into razor-sharp blades, scrapers for cleaning hides, and deadly spear points, each one crafted with a precision born from absolute necessity. They also mastered working with bone and antler, carving them into barbed harpoon points for fishing in the glacial rivers and delicate needles for sewing. These tools were more than just instruments of survival. They were a testament to a growing ability to think abstractly, to plan ahead, to imagine a solution to a problem before it even arose. Hunting in this world was no simple act. It was a high-stakes endeavor that required immense courage and complex cooperation. Small groups of hunters would work together to track their massive prey across the open ground, using their knowledge of the landscape to drive the animals into ambushes or towards other hunters armed with spears. A single successful behemoth hunt could feed an entire band for weeks, providing a bounty of meat, fat, and raw materials. But a failed hunt could mean days of gnawing hunger and the ever-present threat of starvation. Even in the midst of this constant struggle for survival, they found ways to create, to express something beyond the immediate needs of the body. In deep caves and rock shelters scattered across Europe and Asia, they left behind a breathtaking legacy of paintings and carvings. The great behemoths, steppe bison, wild horses, and reindeer line the walls, drawn with a confident hand and an attention to detail that suggests a deep, intimate familiarity with their subjects. These were not just crude decorations. They may have been a way to teach hunting techniques, to remember past successes, or even to perform shamanistic rituals, a way to connect with the spirit world. They are proof that even in a world where every single day was a fight to endure, there was still room for beauty, for meaning, for something more than mere survival. Clothing, too, became a highly developed form of technology. Our early ancestors stitched animal furs together with fine bone needles, layering different types of garments to create an insulated shell that could block the wind and trap precious body heat. They fashioned boots lined with dry grass and soft hide to protect their feet from freezing on the icy ground. Each piece of clothing was shaped by generations of trial and error, refined over centuries until they could face the open wind and driving snow and keep moving. The cold demanded this kind of relentless, life-or-death ingenuity. Every tool, every shelter, every fire-lit gathering was a hard-won answer to the same fundamental question: how do we live here? And slowly, generation by generation, humans learned not just to survive, but to thrive in places where the unprepared would have perished in a matter of hours. They watched the animals, studying their migrations and the way they used the land. They followed the herds to fresh grazing grounds, drank from the rivers carved by melting glaciers, and mapped the world not with ink or symbols, but with a deep, collective memory. And in the long, dark nights, they told stories. Gathered around the fire while the wind howled beyond their walls of bone and hide, their voices carried through the darkness. They spoke of great hunts, of dangers faced and overcome, and of the strange, immense, and often terrifying world around them. Those stories were more than just comfort or entertainment. They were a vital way of passing down knowledge, of teaching the next generation how to survive in a land where a single mistake could be fatal. Yet even in this unforgiving world, there were moments of quiet, profound connection. A fire crackling in the deep darkness, a child curled up against their mother, warm and safe beneath layers of soft fur, the soft hum of voices blending with the sound of the wind outside. In those small, precious moments, the great winter was not only a test of endurance, it was also the crucible where humans began to forge themselves into the adaptable, resilient, and creative creatures they would one day become. For a time, they were not alone in this frozen world. Other kinds of humans, like the elder kin, shared the same harsh landscape. They too had mastered the cold, building their own shelters and hunting the same great herds. In some places, these different human groups may have met, exchanged tools or knowledge, or even interbred, leaving faint but unmistakable traces of their interwoven lives that still echo in our DNA today. In the deep past, under the pale, hazy light of a frozen sun, the boundaries between survival and innovation began to blur, and humanity's future was slowly but surely being written in firelight and shadow. These were not the bustling cities or great civilizations of later ages. These were small, scattered clusters of people, bound together by kinship and necessity, their lives and cultures shaped entirely by the land they walked. Every step they took, every choice they made, every single spark of fire they lit in the snow was part of a slow, inexorable march forward. A quiet, stubborn determination to live in a world that seemed designed to push them back at every turn. And as their fires burned brightly against the endless dark, the cold outside never truly relented. The ice still loomed on the horizon. The wind still carried its burden of dust across the plains. But within those fragile, flickering circles of warmth, humans endured. And in enduring, they began to change the world in ways that would outlast the great winter itself. The cold would not break them. It would forge them. And in that forging, they would take the first critical steps toward everything that came after. In the flickering glow of their fires, with the bone-chilling wind pressing relentlessly at the hide walls of their shelters, your ancestors began to do more than simply endure. They learned to hold the world in their minds and then reshape it with their hands. Every tool they meticulously chipped from stone, every ghostly line they drew on a hidden cave wall, was another defiant step toward mastering the great winter, rather than merely surviving its suffocating embrace. The stone was their most faithful, if unforgiving, resource. From frozen riverbeds and jagged cliff faces, they gathered nodules of firestone and quartz, cold and heavy in their hands. They learned its secrets through touch, through sound, through countless failures. They understood that each stone held a hidden potential, a blade or a point sleeping within its raw form. The act of creation was a dialogue between the maker and the material. Imagine the mind of one of these artisans. They would hold a piece of flint, turning it over and over, feeling its weight, its balance, its internal fractures. They were not just looking at a rock, they were looking through it, visualizing the finished tool that lay dormant inside. This was a profound cognitive leap, the ability to see not just what is, but what could be. The process itself was a symphony of controlled violence. A sharp, percussive crack as a hammerstone struck the core, sending a shockwave through the crystal lattice. A flake would shear off, its edge sharper than any surgeon's scalpel. It was a dangerous art, A misplaced strike could shatter the entire piece, wasting hours of effort, or send a razor-sharp shard flying into the maker's eye. The first tools were simple, opportunistic flakes, used for the brutal, necessary work of scraping hides or butchering meat. But over thousands of years, over countless generations of passed-down knowledge, they became objects of incredible refinement and deadly beauty. Hunters learned to craft long, symmetrical, leaf-shaped blades that could be hafted onto wooden shafts, creating spears that flew straight and true, weapons that could bring down the largest and most dangerous animals of the steppe. They learned to shape bone, ivory, and antler into barbed points that would not pull out of a wound, and elegant hooks for catching fish in the swift, cold rivers. These weapons were more than just instruments of survival. They were tangible proof of a mind that could think in sequences, a mind that could plan, innovate, and perfect. But their ingenuity was not reserved for the hunt alone. They created specialized scrapers with curved edges to smooth and soften tough hides into pliable, workable leather for clothing. They fashioned sharp, pointed awls from bone to pierce holes for stitching, allowing them to sew tailored garments that fit tightly enough to block the wind and hold in precious body heat. In a world where exposure to the elements could be a swift and silent killer, the ability to make a well-sewn coat or a sturdy pair of boots was a technological advancement as vital as any weapon. And then, alongside these practical, life-sustaining tools, came something utterly unexpected, something that speaks to us across the chasm of time with a power that can still raise the hairs on your arms. Art. Deep inside the labyrinthine darkness of caves, far from the reach of the sun, in the cold and silent womb of the earth, your ancestors left their marks, ghostly images that would last for tens of thousands of years. They painted the great beasts of their world, the shaggy behemoths, the steppe bison, the wild horses, and the long-horned ibex. Their powerful outlines were traced in rich mineral ochres, red, yellow, and brown, and deep, velvety charcoal. Some scenes were simple, elegant portraits of a single animal. Others showed entire herds in motion, captured with such anatomical precision and fluid grace that even today their muscles seem to ripple and their legs seem to pound the phantom ground. And pressed against the cold, damp walls, handprints still remain, stenciled in pigment, a ghostly gallery of signatures. It is as if the people who made them were reaching out across the abyss of deep time, leaving an unmistakable sign that they had been there, that they had seen this world and felt the profound, overwhelming need to have it remembered. No one can say for sure why they did it. This is one of the greatest and most tantalizing unresolved enigmas in the human story. Why would people, whose lives were a constant struggle for physical survival, risk a perilous journey deep into the lightless, dangerous underworld to paint pictures that few would ever see? Perhaps these breathtaking images were part of secret ceremonies, magical rituals intended to summon luck for the hunt, or to honor the powerful spirits of the animals they depended on for their very existence. Perhaps they were lessons for the young, a visual textbook used in initiation rites to teach them to recognize the shapes, movements, and behaviors of the creatures they would one day have to track and kill. Or perhaps, just perhaps, they were simply expressions of something so deeply, fundamentally human that it transcends time and circumstance, the irrepressible urge to create, to find meaning, to make beauty, even when, especially when, the world outside is hard, cold, and unforgiving. The mystery only deepens when you consider the carvings they left behind, small, powerful figures meticulously sculpted from behemoth ivory or soft stone. Some are shaped like the animals they hunted, rendered with the same loving attention to detail as the paintings. Others, however, are stylized representations of the human form, most famously the so-called idols of ivory, with their exaggerated rounded features. Their exact purpose remains a profound mystery, but they speak of a mind that was not only concerned with food, warmth, and shelter. These were the first sparks of a symbolic consciousness, tangible proof that even in the long shadow of the great glaciers, humans carried within them an urgent need to give physical shape to their abstract ideas, their fears, and their hopes. These same minds were developing new, more complex ways to organize their lives. Hunters learned to work in large, coordinated groups, using sophisticated strategies to drive entire herds of animals toward cliffs or into prepared ambushes. They tracked the seasonal movements of the herds with the precision of astronomers, timing their own migrations to coincide with the arrival of their prey, mapping the vast, featureless land in their collective memory. Around their fires, they shared not just stories, but a wealth of practical knowledge: how to find the best firestone, how to properly cure a hide, how to read the subtle signs of an approaching storm, how to choose the safest path across a river swollen with glacial meltwater. Nothing was written down, of course, but nothing was lost either. Each critical skill was passed meticulously from one generation to the next, a fragile, unbroken chain of knowledge stretching through the deepest cold. Even the simple fundamental act of making fire was transformed. Early humans learned not only how to keep a precious, captured flame alive, but how to conjure it from nothing. With a piece of iron pyrite and a sharp shard of flint, they could strike sparks into a nest of dry tinder, carefully coaxing the tiny glowing embers until they bloomed into steady, life-giving flames. Fire was no longer a lucky accident, a gift stolen from a lightning strike or kept alive through sheer exhausting vigilance. It was theirs, theirs to make, theirs to control. And in that quiet, revolutionary mastery lay the foundation of everything that would follow. But it was the art, the ghostly images in the deep caves, that revealed the truest and most profound transformation. In the flickering, dancing light of an animal fat torch, the rough walls of a cave became something more than bare stone. They became a portal, a stage for memory, myth, and meaning. Here, deep in the earth, surrounded by the powerful moving shapes of behemoths and bison, drawn in deep earthy red and absolute black, people could look upon their world not only as it was, but as they understood it, as they felt it. What do you believe these ancient artists were trying to say to us? Was it magic, a story, a prayer? Share your thoughts on this incredible mystery in the comments below. They were no longer just surviving in the great winter. They were beginning to define it, to interpret it, to give it a human meaning. And in those quiet, sacred spaces hidden from the wind and snow, the first fragile hints of what we would one day call human culture began to take their shimmering form. The tools grew sharper, the shelters grew stronger, the art grew more intricate and more mysterious, piece by painstaking piece. Your ancestors were learning how to bend the cold world to their will, instead of simply being broken by it. Yet even as they learned to shape their world with tools and symbols, they remained a small, vulnerable part of it. Beyond the flickering edges of their fires and the dark mouths of their caves, the land still belonged to the great predators that stalked the steppe. And if these new thinking people were to hold on to their fragile place in this frozen wilderness, they would have to learn to live alongside those other, older hunters, sharing the same ground and facing the same harsh, beautiful, and utterly unrelenting world. The great winter was not only a world of vast herds and clever human hunters armed with stone-tipped spears. It was also, and always, the domain of the great predators, creatures forged by the intense pressures of the cold into perfect, lethal instruments of survival. To walk the frozen plains was to live with a constant, prickling awareness that danger moved in the shadows, its presence as much a part of the landscape as the ice, the snow, and the ever-present wind. Among the most fearsome and iconic of these were the scythe-tooths. Their long, gracefully curved fangs have become the very symbols of this lost age, twin blades of bone and enamel that could pierce deep into the thick flesh of their prey. These were not cats built for long, elegant chases across the plains. Their legs were immensely powerful, but relatively short, their bodies stocky and barrel-chested, their incredible strength concentrated in their massive shoulders and neck. They were the ultimate ambush predators, masters of patience and explosive power. They would lurk in the low, sparse shrubs or along the edges of river valleys, their dappled coats providing surprisingly effective camouflage until an unsuspecting steppe bison or a young stray behemoth wandered too close. When they struck, it was with terrifying speed and brutal efficiency, their fangs driving home with the full force of their body weight. A precision strike designed to sever major arteries and bring the great struggle to a swift, bloody conclusion. Yet, the scythe-tooths were not the only hunters to be feared in this dangerous world. The great cave lions, nearly twice the size of any lion alive today, prowled the entirety of the behemoth steppe. Unlike the more solitary scythe-tooth, these enormous cats likely hunted in organized, intelligent groups. Their close cooperation giving them a decisive advantage over even the largest and most formidable prey. Imagine a pride of them fanning out across the snow-dusted plains, their pale, tawny coats blending seamlessly into the muted light, their massive paws moving silently over the frozen ground. Very few animals, no matter how large or well-armed, could have withstood a coordinated, strategic attack from a group of predators of such breathtaking size and strength. Then there were the dire wolves, heavier, stronger, and more powerful than the wolves we know and revere today. They roamed the frozen world in large, disciplined packs, their sheer numbers and relentless stamina turning them into one of the deadliest and most efficient forces of the great winter. They were coursers, built for the long pursuit. They would follow the great herds for miles, testing them, probing for weakness, until they could isolate a young, old, or infirm individual. Then the chase would begin, a long drawn-out battle of endurance that often ended with the exhausted prey being brought down by the sheer weight and ferocity of the pack. For your human ancestors, these wolves were both dangerous rivals and a source of grudging respect. The sound of their complex howls rolling across the vast empty steppe on a frozen night was a haunting, primal reminder that in this world, the hunters could never feel truly safe. Even the smaller predators held their own respected place in this unforgiving hierarchy of fear. The wolverine, a creature of disproportionate fierceness and relentless tenacity, was a formidable scavenger that could drive away animals many times its own size from a kill. Swift-footed foxes darted at the edges of every hunt, their cleverness allowing them to steal scraps whenever the opportunity arose. And high above, great raptors with immense wingspans circled on the cold thermals, their piercing eyes waiting for the moment to descend upon the remains left behind by the great hunters of the ice. Humans, of course, did not exist outside of this brutal food chain. They were an integral part of it. When they ventured out from the relative safety of their shelters to hunt or scavenge, they were constantly at risk of crossing paths with these other, more powerful predators. A single moment of inattention, a single misstep on the trail, could instantly turn the hunter into the hunted. This constant, grinding pressure forced people to be preternaturally cautious, to travel in groups, to develop a deep, sensory awareness of their surroundings, and to always keep their fires burning bright at night as both a source of warmth and a flickering, uncertain warning to the things that moved in the dark. The warm, inviting glow of a campfire was a fragile, permeable barrier against the immense cold darkness, but for the most part, it was enough to hold the deepest shadows at bay. The complex relationship between humans and the great predators, however, was not solely one of fear. It was also one of intense competition and, perhaps, a strange kind of kinship. When our early ancestors tracked a herd of bison, they sometimes found themselves following the very same trail as a pack of dire wolves, each species warily watching the other. When they scavenged the remains of a behemoth, they might arrive to find a scythe-tooth already feeding, its great head buried in the carcass. In these tense, dangerous moments, survival was not only about strength, but about intelligence, about nerve, about knowing when to fight, when to retreat, and when to wait patiently for the larger, more powerful predator to finish its meal and move on. Yet in time, humans found ingenious ways to tip this delicate balance in their favor. Stone-tipped spears gave them a crucial advantage of reach. Their ability to use and control fire gave them a weapon that even the boldest and most fearsome predators hesitated to challenge. Slowly, generation by generation, they became more than just another species of prey that fought back. They became clever, unpredictable rivals that could not be easily dismissed or ignored. Still, this was never a relationship of dominance. It was, at best, a tense truce, born of necessity, an uneasy and constantly renegotiated coexistence on the vast open stage of the steppe, where every living thing fought for the same few precious life-sustaining calories of meat and fat. The great predators shaped the behavior of humans just as much as humans shaped the behavior of the herds. The ever-present need to watch, to listen, to stay alert, to plan every movement with care and foresight. These became ingrained in the human psyche, a part of our very nature. And perhaps in the constant presence of the scythe-tooths and the cave lions, your ancestors learned something else, something of profound importance, the ultimate value of cooperation. Alone, a single person was terrifyingly vulnerable, but together, gathered around their fires, armed with their shared knowledge, their sophisticated tools, and the power of their language, they stood a chance. The Great Winter was a world that never allowed anyone, beast or human, to forget what lurks beyond the reach of the firelight. The great predators of the Frozen Age were a constant, tangible reminder that survival was never, ever guaranteed. And yet, it was in this beautiful and dangerous world that humans sharpened not only their stone spear points, but also their minds, becoming something more than just one more clever animal moving across the endless steppe. As the great hunters prowled the snow and the wind swept over the frozen plains, the stage was set for a new and complex struggle, one that would ultimately shape the fate of the very giants that had ruled this land for so long. It was a struggle that would decide which species would endure the coming changes, and which would fade forever into the long, silent memory of the Great Winter. The Age of Ice was an age of impossible scale. Everywhere you turned, in every corner of this lost world, there was something larger, stranger, or more formidable than anything that walks the earth today. It wasn't only the shaggy behemoths or the scythe-tooths that defined this era. Across every continent, in every habitat shaped by the pervasive cold and the relentless wind, there were creatures that seem almost mythical to us now, a vivid and humbling reminder that this was a wilder, grander planet than the one we now know. On the open grasslands of the behemoth steppe, the great tusked herds were only the beginning of the spectacle. Beside them roamed the woolly rhinoceroses, magnificent beasts, broad-shouldered and cloaked in a dense, shaggy fur, their long, forward-sweeping horns like natural battering rams. These animals were immensely powerful, well-equipped to defend themselves against nearly any predator. And yet they shared the endless steppe with herds of bison that stood taller than a man at the shoulder, with wild horses that possessed a thick, stocky frame built for endurance, and with placid muskoxen designed by evolution to survive the most unrelenting cold. Farther south, in the regions where the ice gave way to open coniferous forests and temperate plains, other, different giants ruled. The mastodons, more solitary than their behemoth cousins, wandered among the spruce and pine trees, stripping bark from the trunks with their long, flexible proboscises. They were distant relatives of the behemoth, smaller in stature, but no less imposing. In the Americas, the ground sloths were creatures out of a dream, some reaching the size of small cars as they lumbered through the woodlands, their massive, hook-like claws used for digging up roots and tearing entire branches down from the trees above. And in these same lands, where these slow-moving, colossal herbivores roamed, equally colossal predators followed. The short-faced bear, a true monster of the plains, towered over any living bear species today. Its long, slender legs suggest it was built not for lumbering, but for running, carrying it at incredible speeds across the grasslands of North America in pursuit of prey. In the isolated continent of Australia, the world was no less strange and wonderful. There, giant kangaroos with powerful muscular limbs shared the land with marsupial lions, Fearsome predators unlike anything else on Earth, with bolt cutter-like teeth, enormous flightless birds, far heavier and more powerful than modern ostriches, stalked the open country, while giant reptiles, far larger than their modern descendants, lingered in the rivers and swamps, their armored bodies and crushing jaws a direct, living link to the deeper time of the dinosaurs. Even the cold, shrunken oceans of the Great Winter carried their own share of forgotten wonders. Along the newly exposed coastlines, early humans and marine predators found new hunting grounds. In the kelp forests of the northern Pacific, enormous marine mammals like the stellar sea cow, a gentle, manatee-like giant, grazed peacefully on the underwater meadows, while fearsome, powerful sharks, including the ancestors of the great white, still prowled the deeper, colder waters. The life of the Great Winter was not simply land-bound. It was a global, interconnected network of giants. What made this world of megafauna even more extraordinary was the sheer, unbelievable density of these animals. The behemoth steppe and the surrounding regions were among the most productive ecosystems the planet has ever seen, supporting a biomass of large herbivores and the predators that followed them that dwarfs anything in our modern world. Food was never easy to come by, but the unique, cold, dry conditions produced vast, continent-spanning grasslands that created an unending stage for colossal herds to roam and for great hunters to stalk. And humans, your ancestors, lived among these magnificent creatures in a state of precarious, delicate balance. To hunt a behemoth or a steppe bison was to risk everything, but the potential rewards, a mountain of meat, fat, hides, and bone, were too great to ignore. A single successful hunt could ensure the survival of an entire band of people for months. Yet there was always the profound danger of sharing the land with predators that could not only challenge humans for their hard-won kills, but also for their very lives. To survive in this world of giants, humans became master observers, naturalists of the highest order. They learned the intricate habits of every creature they encountered, the way bison would gather and face into an approaching storm, the ancient, invisible trails the behemoths followed to reach the best grazing grounds, the subtle, deadly patterns of the predators that shadowed the herds. Each and every scrap of this hard-won knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, for all its constant danger, this was a world of breathtaking richness and majesty. Imagine yourself standing on a high ridge, looking out over the plains of the Great Winter. Before you stretches a veritable ocean of grass and movement. A family of behemoths pushes slowly through the snow, their dark forms immense against the pale landscape. A vast herd of bison kicks up clouds of frost with their hooves. A band of wild horses stamps and snorts in the cold, clear air. In the far distance you see the dark, patient shapes of predators, following the herds with a calm, deliberate determination. And high overhead, vultures circle on the wind, their sharp eyes fixed on the eternal drama of life and death playing out below. Everywhere you look, the world is alive, immense, beautiful, and utterly untamed. But this incredible abundance, this world of giants, was profoundly fragile. It was held together by the precise climatic conditions of the Great Winter, the cold, the dryness, the vast open grasslands. As the cosmic waltz of the planet continued and the climate began its inevitable shift toward warmth, this world of giants would be challenged in a way it had never been before. The great ice sheets would begin to retreat. The forests would reclaim the open plains. The rivers would swell and redraw the map of the land. And the magnificent creatures that had once ruled the Great Winter would face a final challenge that most of them could not overcome. Before that great change came, however, this wilder, grander Earth thrived. It was here, in the age of behemoths and scythe-tooths and towering, slow-moving sloths, that humans sharpened their tools, their wits, and their stubborn, unyielding determination. They did not merely live in the long shadow of giants. They learned from them. They hunted them. They painted their spirits on the walls of caves. And soon, as the ice began its long final retreat, the complex and intimate relationship between humans and these massive creatures would shift in ways that would alter the course of life on this planet forever. The Great Winter did not end with a single dramatic thaw. It was not a sudden, cinematic collapse of the cold, or an overnight vanishing of the great glaciers. Instead, its end was a long, messy, and uneven retreat, a slow century-by-century unraveling of the frozen grip that had held the world in its thrall for 100,000 years. The Earth began to shift in small, almost imperceptible increments, and each tiny change carried with it a cascade of consequences that would reshape the land, the seas, and the lives of every creature that depended on them. It all began with a warmth so subtle that it might have gone entirely unnoticed on a human timescale. The northern summers grew slightly longer, slightly warmer. The snows that once lingered deep into the year began to melt more completely. The glaciers, those immense continent-spanning rivers of ice, felt the difference first. Their southern edges, which had for so long been advancing or holding steady, began to soften and thin. Meltwater, the lifeblood of a warming world, trickled across their vast frozen surfaces, carving intricate channels that grew wider and deeper with each passing season. What had once been a landscape of silent, static ice now began to move and groan with a new kind of restless urgency. These early meltwaters, unleashed from their frozen prison, cut through the land like knives. Great glacial rivers, choked with silt and ground-up rock, burst forth from beneath the retreating ice, reshaping entire valleys and carving out new, braided channels across the plains. Vast temporary lakes formed where the ice blocked their path, only to drain away in sudden catastrophic floods when those ancient, icy barriers finally gave way. Each of these floods tore across the land with an almost unimaginable, unstoppable force, leaving behind deep, permanent scars that would last for ages. As the great glaciers withdrew, they revealed a new ground, a land that had not seen the light of the sun in thousands upon thousands of years. This raw, virgin land was barren at first, scraped clean down to the bedrock by the grinding, scouring weight of the ice. But life, ever opportunistic, wasted no time in reclaiming it. Mosses and lichens, the hardy pioneers of the living world, crept in first, clinging tenaciously to the exposed rock. Then came the grasses, their seeds carried on the wind, their tenacious roots sinking into the fresh, mineral-rich soil. Slowly, the barren gray ground was transformed into new, vibrant ecosystems, thin green threads of life woven across the immense gray scars of the retreating ice. The animals, of course, followed the green. Herds of bison and the last of the behemoths moved into the freshly uncovered plains, grazing on the new, tender growth. Predators shadowed them, filling the same ancient roles they always had, but now in a rapidly and confusingly changing landscape. Humans, too, pressed forward into these new frontiers. They tracked the rivers, hunted along the very edges of the shrinking glaciers, and became the first people to step into entire regions that had been buried under miles of solid ice for generations. But the great retreat of the glaciers was not a steady, linear process. It was chaotic, marked by strange pauses and even dramatic reversals. Long periods of slow, steady warming were punctuated by sharp, sudden returns of the intense cold, moments when the ice would surge forward once more, reclaiming the very ground it had just lost. These were geologically brief events, lasting only a few centuries, but for the people and animals living through them, they were terrifying and disorienting reminders that the Earth's great thaw was far from simple or predictable. One of the most dramatic and mysterious of these reversals plunged the world back into a deep, near-glacial chill just as it seemed to be warming for good. For over 1,000 years, the advance of spring was halted. The nascent forest withered, the grasslands retreated, and survival became, once again, a brutal matter of sheer endurance against the resurrected cold. And yet, Even that last violent gasp of the great winter eventually gave way. When the cold finally loosened its grip for good, the glaciers began to retreat faster than ever before. The seas, fed by the meltwater of 1,000 dying rivers of ice, began their inexorable rise. Ancient sunken lands began to vanish beneath the waves. The land bridges that had once carried humans and animals across the continents were slowly, relentlessly swallowed by the encroaching ocean. The sunken path, the vast tundra that had for so long linked Asia to North America, slipped beneath the rising waters of what is now the Bering Strait. The drowned heartlands, once a rich and fertile hunting ground between Britain and mainland Europe, was drowned by the rising North Sea, becoming a memory, a ghost haunting the fishermen's nets. As the world warmed and became wetter, great forests began to creep northward, replacing the vast open grasslands of the behemoth steppe. Trees, birch, pine, and eventually oak, spread across Europe, Asia, and North America, transforming the wide-open plains into shadowed, dense woodlands. Many of the great giants of the Frozen Age, creatures evolution had built for a world of cold, dry air and endless open space, found themselves trapped and hemmed in by this new closed-in landscape. Some adapted. Many did not. For humans, this profound transformation was a double-edged sword, a time of both great peril and great opportunity. As the glaciers retreated and the climate finally began to stabilize, they discovered new lands rich in rivers, fertile soil, and a wealth of new resources. They followed the meltwaters, settled near the new lakes, and in the valleys carved by the ice, and began the long, slow, and arduous process of turning from wandering specialized hunters of giants into something entirely different. The first generalized settlers of a warming, greener world. Yet even as they learned to adapt to this new earth, the glaciers remained a powerful memory carved into the very bones of the land. Their deep U-shaped valleys became the highways for the world's great rivers. Their vast deposits of silt and stone became the fertile foundations of future farmlands. Their slow, agonizing retreat marked not only the end of an age of profound cold, but the true beginning of the world that would follow. The great winter was not over yet, not quite, but its immense strength was finally broken. The colossal walls of ice that had once seemed eternal and indestructible were fading, and in their place, new, green, and vibrant landscapes were emerging. The last great, catastrophic floods were still to come, and with them, the final, violent transformation of the planet. As the great glaciers of the world weakened and the planet warmed, the ice did not simply melt away into a gentle, quiet spring. It fought its way out of existence, dying in fits and starts, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in cataclysmic, world-altering bursts of unimaginable violence. Deep beneath and within the shrinking, rotting sheets of ice, colossal amounts of water gathered in vast hidden reservoirs, held back only by fragile temporary walls of frozen mass that had stood for thousands of years. When those ancient walls finally failed, the earth itself seemed to roar with their passing. These were not ordinary floods. They were geomythological torrents, deluges so immense that they could permanently rewrite the surface of the land in a matter of days, even hours. In North America, one of the greatest and most dramatic examples of this lay trapped at the edge of the dying northern crown. As the great ice sheet melted, a massive body of fresh water, a glacial lake of truly epic proportions, formed along its southern rim. This lake was larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined, a vast inland sea of cold, fresh water. For centuries, it remained precariously trapped behind shifting walls of ice and land. But ice is not permanent. It is not stone. When its last great barriers finally gave way, the lake exploded outward in a flood that would have been beyond anything the human eye could possibly comprehend. A wall of water, hundreds of feet high, carrying chunks of ice the size of buildings, surged across the land with an unstoppable, terrifying force. Entire valleys were drowned in mere hours. Rivers that had been small and meandering were instantly transformed into raging, continent-spanning torrents, miles wide. These floods carried boulders the size of houses as easily as a normal river carries twigs, grinding the very earth and scouring deep, permanent channels into the solid bedrock. They poured with incredible violence toward the distant oceans, and their sudden, massive influx of cold, fresh water may have been enough to temporarily alter ocean currents and even the climate itself. Each one of these great floods was like a convulsive jolt to the recovering planetary system, reshaping wind patterns and redistributing heat across the entire globe. And this was not an isolated event. All around the tattered edges of the world's melting glaciers, other vast hidden lakes lay waiting. Some broke free in violent singular bursts, sending apocalyptic walls of water crashing over the landscape. Others drained more slowly, in a series of pulses, their powerful outflows carving the new river systems that still exist today. The spectacular gorges and channeled scablands of the Pacific Northwest, for instance, were partly shaped by a series of these incredible glacial outbursts, floods so massive that they tore through the land again and again, leaving behind a bizarre alien landscape of sheer cliffs, dry waterfalls, and deep canyons, as if carved by an ancient giant's furious hand. In Europe, similar world-shaping forces were at work. As the continental ice withdrew, meltwater pooled in natural basins, forming huge lakes that eventually overflowed their banks, violently changing the course of ancient rivers and cutting new permanent paths through the land. Even in the heart of Siberia, vast glacial lakes, now long vanished, once covered what are now dry, dusty plains. Their waters were locked in place by towering walls of ice, until they, too, inevitably broke and spilled away in a final, continent-drenching cataclysm. For the small scattered bands of humans who lived in this shifting, chaotic world, these great floods must have been both utterly terrifying and profoundly transformative. Camps and sacred hunting grounds near the shores of these great lakes would have been swept away in an instant, without warning. Entire valleys that had once teemed with game and provided shelter would have vanished forever beneath rushing, silt-choked water. Yet, in their destructive wake, these floods also left behind new landscapes, incredibly fertile plains of fresh sediment, and new permanent waterways that would become the vital lifelines for the many generations that followed. Even the lakes that never burst played a crucial role in reshaping the post-glacial planet. Some remained trapped in the land for centuries after the glaciers had retreated, their placid waters collecting in the deep, rocky scars carved by the ice. Many of the great familiar lakes we know today are the direct remnants of this time, their deep basins filled by the last of the glacial meltwater as the final vestiges of the ice vanished from the land. These new lakes became more than just geological features. They became vibrant reservoirs of life, feeding the new river systems and nourishing the plants and animals that would reclaim the once frozen world. But not all of these lakes were permanent. Many were mere ghosts of the great winter, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared, their waters draining away once the ice that had held them back was finally gone. Others slowly shrank into smaller, more modest forms, their massive, ancient shorelines left behind as high, dry terraces, like the faint, faded memories of a giant's presence etched into the earth. To the people of the time, these immense and often rapid changes must have felt as if the world itself was being unmade and remade under their very feet. One generation might grow up beside a vast, seemingly permanent lake, its distant shores barely visible on the horizon. The next might find that same lake completely gone, replaced by an open, marshy grassland or a new, powerful river running where none had been before. In the short span of a human memory, the land was alive, unpredictable, and dangerously fluid, changing in ways that demanded constant vigilance and adaptation. These great floods and the phantom lakes they left behind were not only endings, they were, in a very real sense, beginnings. They carried away the last remnants of the old glacial world and carved out the fundamental landscapes of our own present one. They created the river valleys where the first agricultural civilizations would one day rise. they left behind the vast fertile plains, enriched with the fine sediments of a vanished age, where we now grow our food. And in their terrifying rush and their eventual placid silence, they marked the final, violent death throes of the great winter, as it finally, irrevocably yielded to a warmer, wetter, and greener earth. But even as the waters reshaped the land, another, quieter, and perhaps more poignant story was unfolding. The fate of the giants, the magnificent creatures that had ruled this frozen world for so long. The age of ice was melting away, and with it, many of the very creatures that had defined it for 100,000 years would soon follow. As the great glaciers retreated and the world warmed, the magnificent animals of the great winter faced a final, insurmountable challenge. For tens of thousands of years, the shaggy behemoths, the woolly rhinoceroses, the giant ground sloths, and the scythe-tooths had dominated their frozen world. They had adapted with magnificent perfection to a life built on the foundations of cold, dry winds and endless open grasslands. But the great winter was ending, and with its passing, the very foundation of their long survival began to crumble away beneath their feet. The first and perhaps most decisive blow came from the changing climate. As the continental ice sheets melted, the behemoth steppe, the vast dry grassland that had for so long supported the colossal herds of enormous grazers, began to shrink and fragment. In its place, moisture-loving forests began to creep northward, their dense canopies of trees closing in on the land that had once been open, boundless, and free. For creatures that evolution had built for the vast open plains, this new closed-in world was suffocating. The nutrient-rich grasses that had fed them for millennia disappeared beneath the shade of leaves, replaced by less nutritious plants and shrubs they were poorly suited to eat. The behemoths and the woolly rhinoceroses could move only so far before the encroaching forest blocked their path. The steppe bison and the wild horses, once able to roam freely across entire continents, found their ancient ranges cut into smaller and smaller, isolated fragments. And the great predators that depended entirely on these massive herds, the dire wolves, the scythe-tooths, and the cave lions, watched as their food supplies dwindled and vanished. Bit by bit, the intricate, beautifully balanced web of life of the great winter began to unravel. But the changing climate alone was not the only force pressing down on these last giants. At the very same time, a new and uniquely resourceful predator was spreading into every corner of their world, us. Armed with sophisticated stone tools honed over thousands of years, and with the complex, shared knowledge passed down through countless generations, human hunters had become incredibly formidable. A single, well-organized band of skilled hunters, armed with lightweight, stone-tipped spears, could bring down even a fully grown behemoth. What had once been a rare, dangerous, and momentous feat became more and more frequent, especially as human populations grew, and their hunting methods became ever more sophisticated and efficient. A fierce and still unresolved debate rages among scientists today. Was it the changing climate or human hunting that ultimately doomed the giants? Some argue that it was not simply one or the other, but a deadly, synergistic combination of both. The great animals were already under immense pressure from their shrinking habitats and dwindling food sources. When the highly effective human hunters arrived on the scene, they may have pushed the already stressed populations past their breaking point, a final, fatal blow from which they could not recover. The evidence for this great dying lies scattered across the face of the earth. In the frozen soil of Siberia, behemoths lie buried in the permafrost, some with clear, unmistakable wounds that could only have come from human weapons. In North America, ancient kill sites show clear archaeological signs of organized, systematic hunts, with behemoth bones intentionally cracked open for their rich marrow and the meat stripped clean. These were not isolated, opportunistic incidents. They were part of a larger global pattern, one that played out with grim predictability wherever and whenever modern humans and the native megafauna met for the first time. And yet, even as many of these magnificent giants disappeared from the earth forever, some clung desperately to survival in isolated pockets. On a remote, fog-shrouded Arctic island, a small, isolated population of behemoths survived for thousands of years after their mainland kin had vanished. They dwindled in size over the centuries, becoming smaller, weaker, dwarf versions of their mighty ancestors. But they endured, cut off from the rest of the changing world by the rising seas. Eventually, even they disappeared, their final passing unrecorded and unknown. But their long, lonely survival stands as a final, poignant echo of a vanished age. The Great Extinction was not a swift, singular event. It happened in waves, beginning in some regions, while the giants still roamed freely in others. In Australia, many of the great marsupial beasts were gone long before the northern ice sheets had even begun their final melt. In the Americas, the behemoths and the scythe-tooths held on until the warming world and the spread of human hunters reached a final, fatal tipping point. By the time the great winter had finally and fully yielded to our modern, warmer climate, the great thundering herds had thinned to nothing, leaving behind only their scattered bones and a profound, planetary silence. This great dying, this extinction winter, reshaped the Earth just as much as the melting of the glaciers. With the loss of the great giants, entire ecosystems shifted their fundamental character. The grasslands, that had once been kept open by the constant grazing and trampling of the great herds, gave way much more quickly to dense forests. The predators that had evolved to rely on large prey either vanished forever or adapted to hunt smaller, faster targets. And humans, no longer sharing the land with these towering, awe-inspiring beasts, suddenly found themselves in a much quieter, emptier, and perhaps lonelier world. Still, a few faint traces of that wilder age remain. The hardy muskox still survives on the high Arctic tundra, a living, breathing fragment of the behemoth steppe. Bison still roam in smaller, more fragmented herds, their resilient ancestors having endured when so many other giants failed. Even the elephants of today in Africa and Asia carry the faint genetic echoes of the behemoths in their blood. But the true giants, the magnificent creatures who once defined the great winter, exist now only as frozen, preserved remains, as scattered mineralized fossils, and in the faint, haunting memory of what the Earth once was. Their disappearance was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one. With the great glaciers gone, and the great beasts fading into memory, the world shifted its balance once more, setting the stage for the rise of a planet that looked for the first time more and more like the one we now call home. When the last of the great beasts had faded into the mists of time and the glaciers had withdrawn to their final polar redoubts, the world began to change in ways that would have been utterly unrecognizable to the people who had lived through the height of the great winter. What had once been a frozen, windswept, and predominantly monochrome planet of ice, snow, and dust began to soften and bloom. The sharp, brutal edges that had been carved by the glaciers gave way to gentler, more verdant forms. The rivers swelled with life. The forests advanced like a slow green tide, and the earth began a profound and final transformation from a world of white to a world of green. The warming was not sudden on a human scale, but its effects were everywhere, touching every part of the globe. The vast continent-spanning sheets of ice that had dominated the northern hemisphere for 100,000 years shrank back toward the poles, leaving behind a scarred but fertile land. In their absence, new valleys opened, vast plains stretched wide, and the deep, rocky wounds left by the retreating glaciers filled with the last of the meltwater. These new, clear, cold lakes became the anchors for a resurgence of life, their shores lined with the first tender green shoots of plants reclaiming a land that had been sterile for an age. The tough, hardy grasses that had once stretched endlessly across the behemoth steppe began to give way to vast, expanding forests. Birch and pine, the hardy pioneer species, came first, their seeds carried on the wind, able to take root and grow in the poor, thin soil and still cool conditions. Then, as the climate stabilized and the soils deepened, came the great broadleaf trees, oak, elm, maple, spreading inexorably northward. Within the span of a few thousand years, entire regions that had once been treeless, open plains were transformed into dense, shadowed woodlands. The wide, open, and often terrifying horizon of the great winter was replaced by a closed, intimate, and sheltering canopy of green. And with the great forests came new kinds of animals. The nimble deer moved into the newly shaded lands, followed by the wild boar and other smaller grazers that thrived in the dense undergrowth of the woods. The wolves, once the great hunters of the open plains, adapted their strategies to the forest, becoming stealthier, more elusive, and more specialized. Even the humans changed with the land, no longer following the vast, predictable migrations of behemoths or bison across an open stage. They learned to hunt the more solitary and elusive creatures of the deep woods. They perfected the bow and arrow to strike their prey from a silent distance, and they created a whole new suite of tools suited not to the vast open steppe, but to the shaded, intimate world beneath the leaves. The new rivers, born from the melting of the ice, carried nutrients into the lands, turning many of these regions into incredibly fertile corridors of life. Fish, like salmon and trout, filled the clear, cold streams, and millions of migratory birds nested along the water's edge. Vast wetlands and marshes formed in the low-lying hollows left behind by the retreating glaciers, attracting a veritable explosion of new life. Where once there had been a landscape of profound scarcity and constant struggle, there was now, in many places, a newfound and almost unbelievable abundance. Even the great oceans of the world were transformed. As the last of the glaciers released their water back into the seas, the shorelines of the world shifted dramatically inward. The ancient coastal plains, where people had hunted for millennia, vanished beneath the rising waves. But in their place, new sheltered bays, estuaries, and tidal flats were formed, teeming with a rich diversity of marine life. Where the sea now met the land, humans found some of their richest and most reliable hunting and gathering grounds, collecting shellfish, catching fish, and hunting sea mammals along the new coasts, adapting once again to a world in constant dynamic flux. But this profound transformation was not only physical, it fundamentally reshaped the very rhythm of life itself. The great winter had been a world of violent, brutal extremes, with its seemingly endless winters and its brief, frantic, and explosive summers. Now, as the climate warmed and stabilized, the seasons became more balanced, more predictable. The springs stretched longer, the summers grew milder, the winters softened their killing edge. The world was no less demanding, but its pace was gentler, its opportunities broader and more varied. And this new, more stable rhythm opened the door to something entirely new in the human story. For the first time in the most resource-rich areas, some groups of humans began to stay in one place for longer and longer periods. They learned to rely on a wide variety of local resources, gathering edible plants and nuts, hunting smaller game, and learning to read the intricate repeating cycles of their newly stabilized environment. Slowly, tentatively, almost accidentally, they began to actively shape the land around them, clearing small patches of forest, scattering the seeds of useful plants, and setting the first revolutionary stones of a future where they would no longer only follow what nature gave them, but would begin to actively mold it to their own will. This great rebirth of the planet was not merely the end of the great winter. It was the essential foundation of the world we know, the vast temperate forests that spread across Europe and Asia, the great grasslands that remained in North America, the swelling rivers and the new, clear lakes. All of these became the rich and varied backdrop for the rise of human society. From these new, green, and gentle landscapes would eventually come the first farms, the first villages, and, in time, the first sprawling cities. Yet even in this greener, more hospitable earth, powerful and poignant reminders of the great winter lingered everywhere. The Great Lakes, carved by the unimaginable weight of the glaciers, still dotted the continents. The wind still carried fine dust from the places where the ice had once ground solid rock into powder. In the far north, the tundra, and the remaining ice sheets still clung to the edges of the world, a pale, silent echo of the great age that had passed. The planet had not simply recovered from the great winter. It had been fundamentally remade by it. Every valley and river, every fertile plain, every great forest that spread in the wake of the retreating glaciers was a direct and lasting legacy of that long frozen era. From the deep, violent scars of the ice came a world made ready for something new, and humanity, no longer just a small, struggling species of hunters on a frozen steppe, was about to take its next and most fateful step forward into the future. But even as the green spread like a healing balm over the wounded land, the memory of the great winter did not fade. Its story was written deep into the stones and soils of the earth, waiting patiently for those who would one day learn how to read its ancient, silent language. Even after the last of the great glaciers had retreated into myth and the world had grown warm and green, the great winter never truly vanished. Its ghostly traces remain all around us, indelibly etched into the surface of the earth and hidden deep within its silent layers. Every deep, U-shaped valley, carved by the inexorable flow of ice, every great solitary boulder, stranded hundreds of miles from its geological birthplace, and every fine, silty band of sediment, locked away in the heart of a stone, is a quiet, powerful reminder of a world that once lay frozen and silent beneath an endless, hazy sky of snow and wind. The most striking and immediately visible of these traces are the landforms themselves. Across North America and Europe, the great U-shaped valleys bear the unmistakable classic signature of the glaciers. Unlike rivers, which carve narrow, winding, V-shaped channels, a glacier is a river of solid ice that scours everything in its path, leaving behind broad, deep valleys with impossibly sheer walls and flat, open bottoms. These dramatic landscapes are the immense shadows of the ancient ice sheets, silent but undeniable proof of their slow, patient, and grinding power. Scattered across the open plains of the world, great solitary boulders tell another part of the story. These glacial erratics, some as large as houses, were plucked from their native mountains, carried for hundreds of miles within the heart of the moving ice, and then unceremoniously dropped, like crumbs from a giant's table when the glaciers finally melted away. They now rest in places where no mountain could possibly have formed them, standing like silent, enigmatic monuments to epic journeys that ended thousands of years before the first human cities were ever built. The lakes, too, are beautiful, life-giving relics of this frozen past. The Great Lakes of North America, the Finger Lakes of New York, and countless smaller ones across the entire Northern Hemisphere were all carved and gouged out by the unimaginable weight and scouring action of the glaciers. When the ice finally withdrew, these deep rocky scars filled with the last of the meltwater, becoming the great freshwater inland seas that we know today. Every gentle ripple on their vast surfaces is a remnant of an age when much of the world was locked away in solid ice. But the most delicate and intimate whispers of the great winter are hidden away in places we cannot easily see. Deep beneath the surfaces of Greenland and Antarctica, ancient layers of ice hold tiny, perfectly preserved bubbles of air that were trapped hundreds of thousands of years ago. Scientists drill deep into these frozen archives, retrieving long cylindrical cores of ice that read like the fragile, transparent pages of a history book. Each distinct layer preserves a single moment in time, recording the exact composition of the ancient atmosphere, the prevailing temperature, and even the amount of dust that was carried by long-vanished winds. From these miraculous frozen records, we have learned how the great winter began, how it breathed in long rhythmic cycles of cold and warmth, and how it finally, messily, loosened its grip upon the world. In the rocks and soils beneath our very feet, there are other equally powerful traces. The Great Loess Plains, vast, thick deposits of wind-blown dust left behind during the Great Winter, stretch across China, Europe, and North America. These deep layers of fine, pale, and incredibly fertile soil were carried on the dry winds of the frozen age and dropped in thick, uniform blankets that still, to this day, feed the great agricultural heartlands of the world. Every single harvest that grows from these unique soils is a quiet, direct legacy of the great glaciers that once scoured the land bare and ground its mountains into fine, life-giving dust. Even the very bones of the great winter remain, pulled from the frozen permafrost of the north and from the deep, dark caves where they have slept undisturbed for millennia. Perfectly preserved shaggy behemoths, their coarse hair and even their internal organs still intact, emerge from the melting soils of Siberia. In North America, the massive bones of mastodons and giant sloths lie buried and perfectly preserved beneath acidic peat bogs. In Europe, the fossilized skulls of cave lions and dire wolves rest in the deep, silent caverns that were once lit by the flickering fires of our early human ancestors. These incredible remains are not just fossils, they are direct, tangible, and deeply moving connections to a lost world. A world where the forces of cold and the struggle for survival shaped everything. The stories that are written in the stone and the ice are not just about the distant past. They are a profound and humbling reminder of how deeply the great winter shaped the world that we live in right now. The fertile soils we farm, the great river valleys we live in, the very coastlines that define our continents, all of these were sculpted and finalized in that long frozen era. Even the modern distribution of plants and animals across the continents was set in motion by the slow, inexorable advance and retreat of the great glaciers. To walk through these special places today is to stand in the very footprint of that vanished world. A hiker tracing the dramatic, soaring rim of a glacial valley, a farmer turning over the rich, dark dust of an ancient Loess plain, or a scientist gently holding a fragile fossilized shard of behemoth tusk. All of them are touching the very same story. It is a story written not in words, but in stone, in water, in ice, and in bone. Yet these ghostly traces are not only silent reminders of what once was, they are living clues, the scattered, tantalizing pieces of a colossal puzzle that we are still, to this day, slowly and painstakingly putting together. Each new valley mapped, each new core of ice drilled from the polar depths, and each new fossil uncovered from the earth deepens our understanding not only of the great winter, but of the immense and powerful forces that still continue to shape our ever-changing planet today. And as we follow these faint whispers through the stone and the ice, we come to a profound realization. The past is not truly gone. It lives on, silent and patient, just beneath our feet, hidden in the familiar landscapes that we see every single day. The age of ice may have officially ended thousands of years ago, but its powerful, formative fingerprints are still everywhere we look. Every time we glance at a map of the world, every time we step outside and see the particular shape of a valley, the winding course of a river, or the intricate crenellated outline of a coastline, we are looking directly at the living legacy of that long and frozen past. The world we live in is not separate from the great winter. It is the world that the great winter left behind. The most obvious and dramatic of these echoes are in the land itself. The Great Lakes, carved out by the grinding, unimaginable weight of the glaciers, still hold a staggering 1/5 of our entire planet's surface fresh water. The smooth rolling hills of New England and the vast fertile plains of northern Europe are draped in thick blankets of glacial sediments, their rich soils made fertile by the fine dust and ground-up rock that was left behind as the ice retreated. Even the winding, meandering courses of many of our modern rivers were first traced by the violent, raging torrents of meltwater that poured from the dying glaciers at the very end of the great winter. In the far north, the age of ice is not just a distant history. It is still a living, breathing present. The vast tundra of Siberia, Alaska, and northern Canada remains frozen for much of the year, its deep permafrost locking away the perfectly preserved remains of a world that once was. In that ancient, frozen ground, the bones of shaggy behemoths still emerge from eroding riverbanks, along with the preserved traces of ancient plants and even dormant bacteria that have slept soundly since the very coldest days of that lost epoch. Our atmosphere, too, the very air that we breathe, still carries the invisible marks of the great winter. The natural cyclical levels of carbon dioxide and the fundamental rhythms of the Earth's climate were shaped in large part by those long frozen cycles. The powerful patterns of our ocean currents and winds, the very systems that carry storms and life-giving rains across the planet, were profoundly influenced by the way the great glaciers sculpted the continents and shifted the immense weight of the Earth's crust. Even today, the planet is still slowly and patiently readjusting from the immense burden of the ice that once pressed it down. The land in places like Scandinavia and Hudson Bay is still rising, millimeter by millimeter, in a slow geological rebound that began thousands of years ago and has yet to fully finish. The living legacy of the Great Winter is also written in the lives of the animals that survived it. The hardy bison still roam the Great Plains of North America, the direct descendants of the vast herds that once grazed alongside the behemoths. The shaggy, unyielding musk oxen remain on the Arctic tundra, virtually unchanged from their ancestors of the Frozen Age. The reindeer and caribou that still migrate in their millions across the far north each year are following ancient paths, carved not only by instinct, but by a deep genetic memory older than human history, a memory rooted in the age of ice and wind. And even within us, within our own DNA, the echoes remain. The great continent-spanning migrations of our own ancestors were guided and channeled by the world of the Great Winter. Humans crossed the great land bridges that were exposed by the low seas. They followed the great herds across the endless behemoth steppe, and they learned to survive in a degree of cold that would have killed the unprepared in minutes. The incredible skills and adaptations that were forged in that unforgiving time, the mastery of fire, the sophistication of tools, the necessity of deep social cooperation, didn't simply fade away with the melting ice. They became the indestructible foundations of everything that followed. In the very landscapes we now farm, in the winding routes of our rivers and the familiar shapes of our coastlines, in the hardy animals that still walk the high tundra, and in the ancient, fossilized bones buried deep beneath our feet, the Great Winter is never far away. It shaped the earth, and in many profound and mysterious ways, it shaped us. But perhaps the most striking and relevant echo of all is this: the Great Winter is a stark and humbling reminder of how quickly and how profoundly our world can change. Entire ecosystems, stable for 100,000 years, came and went. The seas rose and fell by hundreds of feet. Giants walked the earth and then vanished forever. And through it all, life adapted. It survived. It found new, ingenious ways forward. The frozen world may be gone, but its story is not over. It continues in the ground beneath us, in the fossils we uncover, and in the magnificent landscapes that stretch all around us. The Great Winter is not just a forgotten chapter of the deep past. It is the essential prologue to our present. And as we turn from these living echoes toward the world we know now, we can finally step back and look at the full, breathtaking sweep of that long frozen age, from its first, creeping cold to its last, lingering, and beautiful traces. If you could truly walk back into the Great Winter right now, step by slow step, past the familiar forests and rivers of the present and deep into that lost, frozen world, the very first thing you would notice would be the quiet. The wind would still move through the dry grasses, and the snow would still fall from the pale, hazy sky. But there would be a deep, resonant stillness beneath it all, the kind of profound silence that only comes when time itself seems to stretch wider and slower than you can possibly imagine. You would see the horizon open up into vast, unending plains, where the sky feels larger and more present than the earth below it. You would watch the great herds of shaggy behemoths moving slowly and deliberately across the steppe, their hot breath rising in thick clouds against the cold, thin air. In the distance, the steppe bison would graze in long, dark lines that seemed to stretch on forever. And far beyond them, you might catch a glimpse of the faint, shadowy shapes of predators, following the herds with a silent, unnerving patience. The cold would bite deep into your skin, a dry, penetrating chill that feels utterly different from the damp cold of our modern winters. But the world itself would feel intensely alive in a way that is hard to find today. A world of raw, unfiltered, and majestic scale. You might stop at the very edge of a glacier, its towering wall rising like a fractured frozen cliff. The ancient, compressed blue ice gleaming with an internal light where the weak sunlight strikes it. Meltwater would trickle down its face in thousands of thin, glistening streams, the very beginnings of rivers that would one day carve their way across entire continents. The sound of it all would be a low, steady, and resonant hum, a constant, powerful reminder that even the mightiest and most eternal-seeming walls of ice are never truly still. They breathe, they shift, they groan, and eventually they let go. And then if you turned your back away from the colossal ice and walked into the inhabited lands, you would find the subtle traces of human life. A small circular encampment of huts built from behemoth bone and hide, a thin plume of smoke rising from a precious fire at its center. You would see fresh footprints in the snow, a scatter of stone tools laid out for sharpening, and a small band of hunters returning from the distant horizon, their faces weathered and marked by a lifetime of wind and sun. These people would look out at the same vast frozen land, not with our sense of awe or wonder, but with a deep, quiet familiarity. For them, this was not a hostile alien planet or a distant, unimaginable past. It was simply their home. To walk through this world would be to see the Earth in one of its most honest and elemental forms. No cities, no roads, no walls, no borders. Only the slow, patient, and inexorable work of nature, carving, shaping, and remaking everything over the vast sweep of millennia. The great winter was not a frozen prison. It was a teacher. It was a sculptor. And in its own strange and brutal way, it was a beginning. And even though it is gone, its powerful presence has never truly left us. It lingers in the deep valleys and the great lakes carved by its glaciers, in the fertile soil that feeds our crops, in the hardy animals that still roam the coldest, most remote edges of our planet. And it lives on in our own history, in the precious fires our ancestors learned to build, and in the beautiful, deadly tools they carried with them across the endless, windswept snow. If you stand outside on a clear, cold winter's night, when the air is sharp and the world is utterly still, you can almost feel it, a deep, ancient memory that isn't quite yours, but is a part of you nonetheless. A memory written in the stones beneath your feet, carried on the cold north wind, whispered by the quiet, immense weight of time itself. The great winter is not just something we left behind in the distant past. It is something that shaped the very ground we walk on, and the complex, resilient lives we now live. Its long, epic story is written into the fabric of the world. And if you listen closely enough, in the deepest quiet, it is still there, faint but steady, like the sound of distant footsteps in ancient, untrodden snow. And so, as we finally leave this lost, frozen world behind, we find that we carry it with us, every single glacier, every great thundering herd, every fire-lit, vulnerable camp of our ancestors has led directly to this very moment. The age of ice is gone, but its story remains, deeply and permanently etched into the earth and into us. When you look at the land around you, the rivers, the hills, the quiet, immense stretch of the sky, you're seeing its living legacy. When you feel the sharp, clean chill of a winter wind on your face, you're touching something ancient, a faint but real echo of a world where survival was the only language that mattered, and the snow never ever truly stopped falling. We walk now in a different age, a brief, warm, and uncertain interlude of change, but we are a species that was profoundly shaped by the age that came before. And perhaps, in truly knowing that, in feeling that deep connection, we can better see our own place in the long unfolding story of this planet, not as separate from it, but but as its direct and responsible continuation. The great winter, you see, never truly ends. It lingers in stone, in water, in memory, and in the deep, resonant quiet. If you pause long enough to listen, it is still there, patiently waiting. If this journey through time has moved you, please consider liking this video. It helps us to bring more of these lost worlds to light for everyone to experience. Thank you for traveling with us tonight.